Good evening and welcome to the Sleepy Geographer. I'm glad you're here, taking a moment to slow down and let your thoughts wander as the day settles. Tonight we're tracing the quiet story of cities, those vast human hives of stone, steel and light. And yet, for all their size, each one began with a simple question. Why here and not somewhere else? Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from. The comments beneath are like little lights scattered across the globe, and it is always wonderful to see how far this journey reaches. If you find this video relaxing or learn something along the way, a gentle like and a subscribe goes a long way. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this growing map of listeners. Now I should say, I hope this video does not prove so fascinating that it keeps you awake. But if it does, at least you might drift into dreams with a few new pieces of geography tucked away in your thoughts. So, why do cities rise where they do, when so much of the earth lies empty? That is where our journey begins. Cities seem like permanent fixtures of the world, but each one is the result of countless choices and circumstances, woven together over time. They appear where rivers bend, where coastlines provide shelter, where trade routes converge, or simply where people once gathered around a fire and stayed. Geography is at the heart of it all, quietly shaping human life while often going unnoticed. Think of a city not as just buildings and roads, but as a living reflection of its setting. Cairo draws its breath from the Nile, London rests on the tides of the Thames, Mexico City sits high in a mountain basin, while Singapore thrives at the edge of the sea. None of these places are accidental. Behind every skyline is the logic of location, the push and pull of natural forces and human needs. This story is as old as humanity itself. For tens of thousands of years, people moved across the landscape, settling only where survival seemed possible. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities, and cities into centres of culture and power. As they did, the reasons behind their placement multiplied: defence, faith, politics, and later, industry and modern connectivity. In this journey we will explore the many factors that answer the question of why cities rise in some places and not others. We will wander by rivers and harbours, across mountains and deserts, through shrines and palaces, into the mines and markets of empires, and onward to the megacities of today. This is not just geography. It is the story of how humans gather, how landscapes guide us, and how our choices leave marks on the earth that last for centuries. Each chapter is another layer in the answer to that simple question, why here? And so, let us begin at the very start, with the earliest people who chose to stop wandering and instead built the first fires of settlement. Long before towering skylines and sprawling avenues, humanity's relationship with place was a delicate calculation of survival. To understand the origins of cities, one has to step back tens of thousands of years to the scattered fires of small groups who began to linger in chosen landscapes. For most of human history, people were on the move. Bands of hunter-gatherers drifted with the seasons, following migrating herds, ripening berries, and the shifting fortunes of the land. Yet even in these wandering times, some spots called them back again and again, like familiar waypoints in a vast and uncertain world. What made a place worth returning to? The answer, at first, was as simple as water. A riverbank offered not only drinking water, but also a rich source of fish and a steady attraction for thirsty animals, which in turn became prey. Springs bubbling from the ground must have seemed miraculous, eternal gifts where life clustered naturally. Lakes and wetlands provided reeds for weaving, wildfowl for food, and fertile soils nearby for the earliest experiments with planting. Without water, settlement was fleeting. With it, the ground could become home. Food was the second pillar. Early humans were pragmatic. No one lingered where the stomach stayed empty. Plains with grazing animals, forests with nuts and game, coastlines with shellfish all provided reasons to pause. Over time, the pattern repeated. Camps became familiar. Stones were arranged in a circle for the fire. tools were hidden in the roots of trees for later return. Slowly, without ceremony, temporary camps began edging toward permanence. Defensibility mattered too. Life was precarious, and danger lurked in the form of rival groups, wild predators, and the unpredictable forces of nature. A hilltop offered a watchtower over the surrounding land. A bend in the river, defended on three sides by water, gave security with minimal effort. Sheltered caves or rocky outcrops reduced the work of construction. High ground and narrow approaches became the geography of safety. People sought places where danger could be seen before it struck, and where the landscape itself offered protection. Fertile soil provided yet another incentive, though agriculture was still in its infancy. The great shift known as the Neolithic Revolution began around 12,000 years ago, when humans in the Fertile Crescent and other parts of the world started deliberately planting seeds. Once people discovered that grain scattered near their camps could be harvested again the following year, the logic of staying put became irresistible. Suddenly the earth itself was a storehouse, more reliable than wandering after herds. Fertile river valleys, enriched by floods, became magnets for human life. The first true villages arose in places where soil, water and climate aligned to support crops. Archaeology gives us glimpses of these first fires of settlement. Sites like Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, reveal some of the earliest permanent dwellings, dating back nearly 10,000 years. Mud brick houses clustered together, surrounded by a protective wall. This was no longer a campsite, it was a community. People invested their labour not in tents or temporary shelters, but in homes built to last. Similar traces appear in Çatalhöyük, in modern-day Turkey, where houses were packed so tightly together that people entered through the roof. These were not just functional shelters, but beginnings of an organised way of life, with shared rituals, storage and art. Still, permanence was never absolute. Climate shifts could turn fertile ground into dust. Rivers could change course, or resources could be exhausted. Even in these early settlements, the decision of why here was constantly tested by the unpredictability of the environment. When conditions soured, people moved on, sometimes abandoning villages that had thrived for generations. The story of settlement is as much about resilience and adaptation as it is about stability. Yet despite these challenges, the advantages of staying outweighed the risks. Settling in one place allowed for storage of surplus food, which meant fewer hungry winters. It allowed population growth, for families no longer had to carry infants long distances across hostile terrain. It encouraged the development of tools, pottery, and eventually writing, since record-keeping became useful only once there was something permanent to record. Staying put changed everything about what it meant to be human. The first fires of settlement were also social fires. When people lived in close proximity, cooperation became essential. Shared walls required shared trust. Fields of grain needed collective defense from animals and raiders. Rituals and traditions grew to bind communities together. Religion itself may have shifted in this era, from the wide-roaming spirits of the wilderness to deities tied to the land, the harvest, and the cycles of fertility. Permanence anchored belief as much as it anchored dwellings. Geography played an invisible hand in these transformations. A fertile floodplain could support larger populations than a scrubby hillside. A region rich in flint shaped the tools and weapons that defined daily life. Access to salt, crucial for preserving food, determined whether a settlement thrived or failed. Each environmental detail nudged human decisions in subtle ways, shaping where people gathered and where they did not. It is striking to realize how small these first communities were. A cluster of a few dozen homes might have seemed immense compared to a lone family hut. Yet from these beginnings, the pattern of urban life was set. Density encouraged innovation, but it also created tension. With people living side by side, disputes had to be resolved. Rules and customs evolved. Enforced first by elders and later by more formal authority, the village was the seed of both cooperation and conflict, the template for the cities that would one day rise. The warmth of the fire was not just physical, it was symbolic of belonging, of continuity, of human bonds rooted in place. To choose to stay, to build a home and raise children in the same spot, was to stake a claim on the earth. The land itself became part of identity. People began to say, in essence, "This is where we are from," a phrase that would echo across millennia of urban history. Looking back, it is easy to imagine these first fires glowing against the darkness, fragile sparks of permanence in a vast, unsettled world. Each one was a gamble, but together they changed the course of human life forever. The line between temporary camp and permanent village was a thin one, but once crossed there was no turning back. The age of wandering would never fully disappear, but the age of settlement had begun, and with it the slow unfolding of the city. If there is one feature of the landscape that has shaped the fate of human settlement more than any other, it is the river. Flowing water has always been more than a simple resource. It is a lifeline, a highway, a boundary, and a source of both plenty and peril. To look at the earliest great cities is to notice a striking pattern. They almost all appear along riverbanks, nestled close to the rhythm of seasonal floods and the promise of fertile land. Take the Nile, the ribbon of green that cuts through the desert of Egypt. Without it, the surrounding land is barren sand, a place where agriculture would be impossible. With it, ancient farmers discovered that each year the waters rose, spilling rich black silt over the floodplain. This natural renewal meant the soil never wore out, making it one of the most productive farming zones in the ancient world. Cities like Thebes and Memphis did not emerge by accident. They were anchored to this dependable cycle of life and renewal. The phrase, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile," is more than poetry. It is literal truth. The same story repeats with variations along the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, sat between these rivers in what is now Iraq and parts of Syria. Unlike the relatively gentle floods of the Nile, these rivers were unpredictable, sometimes nourishing, sometimes destructive. Yet their combined effect created a patchwork of fertile plains in an otherwise harsh environment. Irrigation canals dug by early Sumerians allowed them to channel the waters, turning danger into abundance. Cities like Uruk and Babylon grew directly from this delicate balance between human ingenuity and the temper of the rivers. Further east, the Indus River gave rise to one of the world's earliest urban civilizations. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, built around 4,500 years ago, thrived on its fertile plains. Archaeological evidence shows careful city planning, complete with drainage systems that would put some medieval towns to shame. Again, it was the river that made such complexity possible, supplying water for crops, transport, and daily life. The river also connected communities across vast distances, allowing trade and cultural exchange to flourish along its course. The Yellow River in China tells yet another variation of this story. Known both as the cradle of Chinese civilization and as China's sorrow, it offered rich loess soils perfect for farming, but carried the constant threat of catastrophic flooding. Entire communities could be swept away, and yet people continued to settle along its banks. The rewards outweighed the risks. Cities such as Anyang rose near the Yellow River because the fertile plain supported dense populations, and dense populations, in turn, gave rise to powerful states. What unites these examples is the river's role as a natural multiplier. Water allowed crops to grow more reliably, which meant surpluses of food. Surpluses allowed specialization. Not everyone needed to farm, so some could become builders, artisans, priests, or rulers. With specialization came trade, hierarchy, and eventually the urban fabric we recognize as cities. A settlement on a river was never just a collection of houses. It was the embryo of a society with layers of complexity. Rivers also served as highways long before anyone dreamed of paved roads. A canoe, a raft, or even a simple reed boat could carry far more goods with less effort than hauling them overland. Cities on rivers became hubs of movement, gathering points for trade from upstream and downstream. Goods, ideas, and even languages floated along the currents, weaving human communities together in ways that dry land rarely allowed. To settle by a river was to plug into a wider world. It is easy to imagine the ancient perspective. A group of settlers standing on the banks of a wide flowing river would have seen it as both a source of awe and an invitation. The water shimmered with life, the banks teemed with plants and animals, and the horizon promised new lands if one simply followed the current. It was geography that seemed to speak directly, saying, "Here, you can build something lasting." Of course, rivers were not without challenges. They flooded at inconvenient times, sometimes sweeping away fields, homes, and lives. They shifted course over decades, leaving once thriving settlements stranded far from the water's edge. They carried disease in stagnant backwaters. Yet people continued to return, again and again, because the benefits far outstripped the dangers. The great gamble of settlement was less risky when played beside a dependable river. The pattern persisted far beyond the earlier civilizations. Even as societies grew more advanced, the gravitational pull of rivers remained strong. Paris rose on the Seine, London on the Thames, and countless smaller towns and villages across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas all followed the same logic. Water gave security, productivity, and connectivity. The formula was ancient, but it never lost its relevance. It is worth reflecting on the emotional pull of rivers as well. Flowing water carries symbolic weight. It is continuity, renewal, and change all in one. For early settlers, these qualities were not abstract. To see a river flood and recede was to witness the turning of the seasons, the assurance that life would go on. To live by a river was to be part of a grander rhythm, one that shaped not only the land but the very cycle of human existence. In the stillness of night, when the day's work was done, families in those first river settlements must have listened to the steady murmur of the water. It was a sound both calming and vital, a reminder that tomorrow's fields would be nourished, and tomorrow's journeys made possible. No wonder so many of the world's first cities placed their trust in the river's embrace. When we look back at the story of rivers and life, it becomes clear that their role was not optional or coincidental. They were the stage upon which human civilization first stepped into the spotlight. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, each one cradled communities that would grow into cultures, kingdoms, and empires. They shaped not just the land, but the course of history itself. To understand why cities rise where they do, one must always listen for the river, winding through time as faithfully as it winds through the land. Stand on the edge of the sea and it becomes clear why so many of humanity's greatest cities grew where the land meets the water. A coastline is not simply a boundary, it is an invitation. The horizon promises fish, trade, and connection to distant worlds, while the shore itself offers a place to anchor boats, build markets, and gather communities. From the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, coastal cities have always thrived on this meeting point between two realms. Athens is a perfect example. Although the city itself lies inland on a rocky plain, its lifeline was always the port of Piraeus. Tucked into a natural harbour, Piraeus sheltered Athenian ships and opened a doorway to the wider Mediterranean. Without it, Athens might have remained just another Greek town. With it, the city became a naval power, a centre of trade, and eventually the cradle of democracy and philosophy. The geometry of the coastline gave Athens not only safety for its fleets, but also access to the grain of the Black Sea, the timber of Macedonia, and the luxuries of Egypt. Geography handed the Athenians a stage, and they filled it with drama, both political and cultural. Carthage tells a similar story, though one with a more dramatic ending. Founded by Phoenician traders on the coast of North Africa, Carthage possessed one of the most extraordinary harbours of the ancient world. 2 connected basins, one circular and one rectangular, could shelter hundreds of ships with secure docks and even a central island for command. This strategic location allowed Carthage to dominate Mediterranean trade, extending its influence across Spain, Sardinia, and beyond. The wealth of Carthage was legendary, built on sea routes and coastal exchange. It was no coincidence that Rome, another city with access to good harbours, eventually viewed Carthage as its greatest rival. The wars between them were battles not just of armies but of geography, fought over who controlled the maritime arteries of the ancient world. Then there is Venice, the improbable city in a lagoon. At first glance, its location seems inconvenient. Shallow waters, shifting sands, and constant flooding. Yet these apparent weaknesses became its strength. The lagoon provided protection from invading armies, while the surrounding Adriatic Sea gave access to trade routes linking east and west. Venetian merchants sailed to Constantinople, Alexandria, and the markets of the Levant, bringing back spices, silks, and stories. Over centuries, Venice transformed its precarious setting into a fortress of commerce. The city rose on wooden piles driven into the mud, a feat of engineering that still holds today. Its canals became thoroughfares, its squares a stage for wealth and ceremony. In the end, what looked like an inhospitable marsh was in fact one of the most strategic maritime hubs in Europe. The story continues into the modern age with cities like Singapore. Situated at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, it controls the narrow Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. For centuries, traders had already recognised this choke point, where the Indian Ocean meets the South China Sea. When the British established a port there in the 19th century, Singapore blossomed into a global hub of commerce. Today it is a city-state whose fortunes are inseparable from its coastline. Its harbours handle millions of containers each year, while its airports and financial markets extend its reach far beyond its tiny territory. Geography gave Singapore little in the way of natural resources, but its position at a maritime crossroads more than compensated. Fishing grounds also played their part. Coastal settlements often began as villages where the sea offered a dependable diet of fish and shellfish. Over time, these villages grew as trade routes overlapped with subsistence fishing. The bounty of the sea was not just food, but also trade goods. Salted fish, dried seaweed, and even exotic shells used as currency in some societies. The combination of secure anchorage and reliable food created the foundations for more complex settlements. Safe harbours were particularly prized. A good harbour meant shelter from storms, a place where ships could repair, resupply, and wait for favourable winds. Natural formations such as fjords, bays, and estuaries became magnets for settlement. Think of Sydney, blessed with one of the finest natural harbours in the world, or San Francisco, where a deep bay provided a perfect refuge for ships even before the famous bridge spanned its waters. These features were gifts of geology, patiently carved by rivers, glaciers, or the sea itself, long before humans learned to sail. Coastal cities were rarely isolated. The sea made them outward-looking, open to influences from afar. A port was never just a local marketplace. It was a meeting ground of cultures. Languages, religions, and technologies all flowed through these urban harbours. The alphabet of the Phoenicians, the spices of India, the porcelain of China, all arrived in cities where ships docked and sailors haggled. The cosmopolitan character of many coastal cities was no accident. It was built into their geography. Of course, life on the shore was not always idyllic. Storms could devastate fleets. Tsunamis could erase entire communities, and pirates often prowled the sea lanes. Yet these dangers rarely outweighed the opportunities. Where there was a safe harbour, there was profit to be made, and where there was profit, cities inevitably rose. Coastal settlements learned to adapt, building lighthouses, breakwaters, and fortresses to tame the challenges of the sea. There's also something symbolic about living at the edge of the land. Coasts embody both security and possibility. To one side lies the familiar solidity of the continent, to the other, the mystery of the horizon. It is no wonder that so many myths and legends are born of the sea, or that coastal cities so often become centres of exploration and imagination. From the ships of the Greek world to the great voyages of the Age of Discovery, the shoreline has always been the launchpad for human curiosity. If rivers were the cradles of civilization, then harbours were its gateways. They opened the world, making distant peoples into neighbours and distant goods into everyday luxuries. Athens, Carthage, Venice, Singapore. Each tells a variation on the same story. Geography may set the stage, but it is human enterprise that plays the music. And when the two come together in just the right way, the result is a city whose influence can stretch far beyond its shoreline. To walk through any great port city today is to feel that legacy. The smell of salt on the air, the cries of gulls, the endless arrival and departure of ships. These are echoes of the forces that shaped civilizations long before modern skyscrapers rose along the docks. Shores and harbours are not simply convenient places for settlement. They are crossroads of the world, where the geography of the coast meets the restless spirit of humanity. Some cities are born not from rivers or coasts, but from the simple fact that they sit at the crossroads of the earth. These are the places where paths converge, where caravans pause, and where mountains or deserts force travellers into narrow channels. Geography, in this sense, is less about resources and more about position. To be at the right junction of routes was to be at the centre of the world, even if the surrounding land seemed inhospitable. The Silk Road is perhaps the most famous example. Stretching thousands of miles from China to the Mediterranean, it was never a single road, but a web of routes crossing mountains, plateaus and deserts. Along these arteries of exchange, cities sprouted like beads on a necklace. Samarkand and Bukhara in Central Asia became legendary for their wealth and splendour. Caravans laden with silk, spices and precious stones had to stop somewhere for food, rest and trade. These cities offered not only markets but also security, storage and the promise of culture. A merchant might arrive with bolts of cloth and leave with gold or glassware, but the real treasure was the mingling of ideas, astronomy from the East, mathematics from the Arabs, and philosophies from many traditions. Desert oases played an equally vital role. Consider the Sahara. Crossing its vast expanses without a lifeline of water would have been impossible, yet scattered across the desert lay green havens where underground springs fed palms and pools. Cities such as Timbuktu and Gao in West Africa rose around these points of life. Caravans carrying salt from the desert and gold from the forests converged there, turning isolated watering holes into centres of learning and commerce. Timbuktu, for instance, became renowned not only for trade but for its libraries and scholars, a beacon of knowledge that shone across Africa and beyond. Without its geography at a natural crossroad of trade, such a flowering would have been unthinkable. Mountain passes also shaped human history. The Himalayas may seem an impenetrable wall, but certain valleys and routes offered passage between the Great Plains of India and the highlands of Central Asia. Cities like Kashgar, at the western edge of China, owed their existence to their position at such gateways. Traders had little choice but to funnel through these narrow openings, and where traffic bottlenecked, opportunity blossomed. Inns, markets and fortresses sprang up to serve and protect the travellers, and before long entire urban communities took root. Europe shows the same pattern. Think of Innsbruck in Austria, whose very name means bridge over the Inn River. Nestled among alpine passes, it became a natural stopping point for merchants moving north and south. The geography dictated that anyone moving through the mountains would pass by, and the town thrived on that inevitability. The same is true for cities like Geneva, perched at the meeting point of trade routes through Switzerland, France and Italy. Their prosperity flowed less from local resources and more from the constant motion of strangers passing through. Crossroads cities often became melting pots. Their streets were filled with people of many languages, each bringing new traditions, goods and stories. Markets brimmed with spices from far-off lands, fabrics dyed in colours unfamiliar to local eyes, and coins stamped with foreign symbols. This cultural exchange often left a lasting imprint. Samarkand's stunning Islamic architecture, Venice's blend of East and West, and Aleppo's legendary souks all grew out of the fusion that happens when people meet at the junction of the world's highways. The geography of crossroads was not always benign. To be at the centre of movement was also to be at the centre of conflict. Armies marched along the same routes as caravans, and control of a key pass or oasis could decide the fate of empires. The city of Constantinople, straddling the Bosporus, was a perfect case. It stood at the meeting point of Europe and Asia, commanding both land routes and sea lanes. Whoever controlled it could tax trade, monitor armies, and influence two continents at once. Little wonder it was besieged so many times, coveted by Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Ottomans. Geography gave it splendour, but also endless peril. Despite such risks, people flocked to crossroads. The attraction was irresistible. For merchants, it was the chance to make a fortune. For travellers, it was safety in numbers. For rulers, it was a chance to tax and control the flow of wealth. Crossroads became the beating hearts of long-distance trade, pumping goods and ideas across vast regions. Even today, remnants of these patterns linger. Cities like Istanbul, Dubai, and Panama City all owe their status to strategic positions at the hinge points of continents and oceans. There is also a psychological element to these places. Humans are drawn to movement, to the hum of activity that comes when many paths intersect. Crossroads, cities buzzed with energy, their streets crowded with caravans arriving and departing, ships unloading and loading, or pilgrims streaming in and out. They felt alive in a way that isolated towns never could. That vitality itself attracted settlers, artisans and thinkers who knew that where people gathered, opportunity always followed. The importance of crossroads is sometimes revealed by their absence. Settlements far from any major route often remained small, no matter how fertile their soil or pleasant their climate. Isolation limited exchange, and without exchange, cultural and technological growth slowed. It was the constant churn of people, goods, and ideas that made crossroads fertile ground for civilizations. Picture a dusty caravan plodding across Central Asia, camels laden with silk, the sun baking the sand. Ahead lies the city of Samarkand, its blue domes shimmering on the horizon. The weary travellers know that within its walls they will find food, water, safety, and a chance to trade. Multiply that image by centuries, by countless caravans and countless cities, and it becomes clear why geography at the junctions of the world mattered so profoundly. In the end, crossroads are not just about location, but about connection. They are the points where lines on the map intersect, where the geography of movement condenses into human settlement. From desert oases to mountain passes, from the Silk Road to the Mediterranean, these cities stand as monuments to the simple truth that where people move, they also meet, and where they meet, cities are born. There is something instinctively reassuring about high ground. From the earliest days of settlement, people understood that to rise above the surrounding land was to claim both safety and visibility. A hilltop village could spot approaching danger long before it reached the gates. A fortress perched on a cliff was more difficult to storm than one sitting on a flat plain. Geography once again whispered to humanity, if you wish to endure, climb. Athens offers perhaps the most famous example. The Acropolis, that rocky outcrop rising sharply above the city, was first a citadel long before it became adorned with marble temples. In times of war, it was the ultimate refuge, a last line of defence against invaders. From its summit, Athenians could survey the surrounding plains, the mountains in the distance, and the shimmering Aegean Sea. The elevated position made it both practical and symbolic. Practical because it was defensible, symbolic because it declared dominance over the land below. What better way to remind citizens and strangers alike of the city's authority then a crown of stone visible for miles. Across Europe, the same logic played out. Edinburgh's Castle Rock is another striking case. This volcanic plug rises abruptly from the Scottish landscape, its steep cliffs on three sides making it almost unassailable. For centuries, whoever controlled the castle controlled the region. Armies could march and kings could argue, but that looming fortress, perched high and stubborn, was always the key to power. The geography here did half the work of defence, saving its occupants from building walls on every side. Even today, the silhouette of the castle dominates the skyline, a reminder of why the city grew beneath it in the first place. Islands provided their own form of defensive height. Venice, for instance, did not rise on a hill but in a lagoon, where shallow waters and shifting sandbanks formed a natural moat. Invading armies on horseback could not easily reach it, while ships unfamiliar with the channels risked running aground. The city was effectively elevated not in altitude but in accessibility. Geography placed it beyond easy reach, which in turbulent medieval Europe was as good as being atop a mountain. Other island cities such as Rhodes or Dubrovnik also used their watery surroundings as protective barriers, transforming vulnerability into security. Sometimes the choice of a hill or cliff was as much psychological as military. A town built above the plain gave its inhabitants a sense of pride, a visible reminder that they held the advantage. In medieval Germany, countless castles were built on crags overlooking rivers or valleys, not only to protect the settlements below, but to project power. Traders moving along the Rhine could not miss the looming fortresses above them, silent announcements of who controlled the passage. Elevation magnified authority. But there were practical reasons too. High ground made it easier to defend with fewer people. Gravity was a natural ally. Arrows fired downhill flew further. Stones rolled onto attackers carried devastating force, and scaling a wall under enemy fire was a nightmare. To assault a hilltop fortress required immense resources, while to hold it required comparatively few defenders. For small communities with limited manpower, a hill was worth more than an army. Defensive heights also helped communities withstand siege. Wells sunk deep into bedrock or cisterns. Collecting rainwater could keep defenders alive when enemies encircled them. Granaries stored on high ground were less vulnerable to sudden raids. Even if the surrounding countryside was lost, a stronghold on a cliff or hill could hold out for weeks or months, buying precious time. In an age when war often meant attrition rather than outright destruction, such advantages could be decisive. Of course, living on a hill came with trade-offs. The climb was exhausting, particularly if you had to carry water, firewood or market goods. Fertile land was usually on the plains below, so farmers had to descend each day to tend their crops. For this reason, many communities developed a dual pattern: fields and markets on the lowlands, but fortifications and key buildings on the heights. In times of peace, life spilled down into the valleys. In times of trouble, everyone retreated upward behind the walls. The geography of settlement often reflected this rhythm, expanding and contracting like a lung depending on whether war or peace prevailed. The tradition of elevated strongholds stretches far beyond Europe. In Central America, the Maya built cities like Tikal on ridges and raised platforms, combining ceremonial grandeur with defensive advantage. In India, forts like those at Jodhpur and Jaipur crown rocky hills, their walls blending into the cliffs as if carved from the earth itself. In Japan, castles such as Himeji rose on stone bases that lifted them above the surrounding plain, creating both an imposing view and a difficult target for attackers. Across continents, the impulse was the same: rise above danger, and you rise above defeat. Sometimes elevation shaped not only defence but identity. Rome itself began on a cluster of hills along the Tiber. The 7 hills of Rome became legendary, anchoring the city's mythology as much as its military history. Each hill was both a neighbourhood and a fortress, contributing to the patchwork that grew into one of the greatest cities in history. To be Roman was, quite literally, to be of the hills. There is a poetic quality to these choices as well. Humans are drawn to high places for reasons that go beyond strategy. To stand on a hill is to gain perspective, to see farther than usual, to feel closer to the sky. Settlements that rose on cliffs or outcrops often took on an air of sanctity, their elevation lending them a spiritual quality. The line between fortress and temple sometimes blurred. Sacred acropolises and fortified citadels were often one and the same, their heights serving both gods and generals. Not every city had the luxury of a hill or cliff, of course. Many flourished on flat plains or beside rivers, but those that did choose elevation left lasting marks on history. Their skylines endure, etched into memory precisely because of their prominence. Even now, tourists flock to hilltop fortresses, climbing the same slopes once scaled by weary soldiers or hopeful settlers. The geography that protected those cities centuries ago continues to define them today. In the end, the defensive heights are reminders that human settlement has always been about more than comfort. People accepted the daily inconvenience of climbing steep paths or hauling water uphill because the trade-off was safety, continuity, and pride. Geography demanded effort, but it repaid with resilience. From Athens to Edinburgh, from island fortresses to mountaintop citadels, elevation has always been one of humanity's most reliable allies. When danger came, it was not the strongest walls or the largest armies that mattered most, but the simple advantage of standing above. Cities are not always born from trade or defence. Sometimes they emerge because a particular place is believed to touch the divine. Human beings have long been drawn to landscapes imbued with sacred meaning. A mountain where the gods were said to dwell, a river thought to purify the soul, a shrine where miracles were believed to occur. Around these sites, settlements grew, nourished not only by geography but by faith. Take the banks of the Ganges. This river is not just a body of water, it is revered in Hinduism as a goddess, a living presence with the power to cleanse sins and grant blessings. Pilgrims have travelled for centuries to cities like Varanasi, where bathing in the river is considered a spiritual act of renewal. The city's streets, temples and ghats, those long stone steps leading down to the water, are arranged with the river at their heart. Daily life and sacred ritual blend seamlessly, and the settlement thrives because of its spiritual magnetism. Without belief, Varanasi would be just another riverside town. With it, it became one of the most enduring sacred cities on earth. Jerusalem is another powerful example. It sits on a modest ridge of hills in the Levant, not particularly fertile, not especially easy to defend, and without a great river or harbour to explain its prominence. Yet it became a focal point for Judaism, Christianity and Islam, shaping world history far beyond its geographical scale. Pilgrims have streamed to Jerusalem for millennia, and its streets have been walked by prophets, kings, crusaders, and ordinary believers alike. The city's geography is sacred not for what it provides in material terms, but for the meanings attached to it. In ancient Greece, sacred geography played a similar role. Delphi, nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, was not a natural hub of trade or agriculture, yet it became a centre of the Greek world because it housed the oracle of Apollo. Pilgrims journeyed from across the Mediterranean to consult the oracle, and in doing so, they filled Delphi with wealth, monuments, and political importance. The settlement flourished because the Greeks believed it to be the very centre of the world, marked by the omphalos stone, the navel of the earth. In this case, belief transformed a remote mountainside into a city of influence. Mecca offers another striking illustration. Situated in the arid lands of the Arabian Peninsula, it might seem an unlikely candidate for global significance, yet it holds the Kaaba, the most sacred shrine in Islam, and has been a pilgrimage site for centuries. Each year, millions of Muslims undertake the Hajj, converging on the city in one of the largest annual movements of people anywhere in the world. The settlement thrives not because of its rivers or fields, as for it has none, but because of its unique role in religious geography. The presence of the sacred draws people, and where people gather, cities take root. Pilgrimage routes themselves have often fostered urban growth. Consider Santiago de Compostela in Spain, the endpoint of the Camino de Santiago. For centuries, pilgrims have walked hundreds of miles across Europe to reach the shrine of St. James. Along the way, hostels, markets and towns sprang up to cater to weary travellers. The route became a thread stitching together communities, and the city at its terminus grew into a beacon of faith and culture. The geography of devotion literally mapped itself onto the landscape. The same pattern can be seen in Asia, where cities such as Lhasa in Tibet developed around monasteries and temples. The Potala Palace, seat of the Dalai Lama, dominates the city both physically and spiritually, drawing pilgrims across the Himalayas. In Japan, Kyoto's countless shrines and temples made it not only a political capital, but also a spiritual one. Sacred architecture often served as the anchor for urban planning, with entire neighbourhoods orienting themselves around a holy site. Water often carried spiritual as well as practical weight. In Islam, cities such as Najaf and Karbala rose around shrines linked to revered figures, while in Hinduism and Buddhism, rivers and lakes became focal points of ritual. Even in Europe, springs associated with healing powers inspired settlements. Lourdes in France, for instance, grew from a modest village into a bustling pilgrimage destination after visions of the Virgin Mary were reported there in the 19th century. Once again, faith and geography intertwined, turning ordinary landscapes into extraordinary destinations. Sacred sites also encouraged cultural and artistic flourishing. Pilgrims brought wealth in the form of offerings, donations, or trade. That wealth funded temples, monasteries, libraries, and schools. Chartres in France, for instance, became famous not only for its cathedral, but for the intellectual life supported by the pilgrims who flocked to it. Angkor in Cambodia, centered around Angkor Wat, was both a religious capital and one of the largest pre-industrial cities in the world. Sacred geography created an ecosystem where art, learning, and urban growth could thrive side by side. Yet building cities around sacred ground was not without challenges. Religious significance often made such places targets. Jerusalem was besieged and rebuilt countless times precisely because of its spiritual weight. Shrines could be plundered, temples razed, and sacred relics contested. The geography of faith created both magnetism and vulnerability. Even so, communities rebuilt, again and again, convinced that the sacred tie to the land was stronger than the destruction of war. Sacred cities also shaped the rhythms of time. Festivals, holy days, and pilgrimages created seasonal surges in population. Markets boomed during religious gatherings, drawing merchants as much as worshippers. Inns and stalls multiplied to serve the influx. The geography of belief was never purely spiritual, it was also profoundly economic. To be a holy city was to be at the centre of networks of exchange, where faith and commerce blended seamlessly. There is something deeply human about this pattern. Beyond rivers, harbours, and defensible hills, people have always needed meaning, and meaning often attaches itself to the land. A cave where a prophet once prayed, a tree struck by lightning, a mountain peak touching the clouds. These became more than features of geography. They became anchors of culture and identity. Settlements grew not only because the land provided food or safety, but because it provided connection to something larger than life itself. In sacred ground, we see how cities can be shaped by the unseen as much as the seen. Belief made landscapes magnetic, pulling pilgrims and settlers to places that might otherwise have been overlooked. From the banks of the Ganges to the hills of Jerusalem, from the shrines of Mecca to the Oracle of Delphi, faith turned geography into destiny. These are the places where the human search for the divine quite literally built cities, carving permanence into landscapes chosen not just for survival, but for the soul. When empires rise, they do not simply inherit the geography around them, they bend it to their will. Capitals are rarely chosen at random. They are statements of power, centres of administration, and symbols of unity. A river or a harbour may explain why a small town thrives, but the decision to crown a capital belongs to rulers, and rulers often reshape the map to suit their ambitions. Rome is a prime example of how geography and politics intertwine. At first glance, its location on the Tiber River seems modest, even unremarkable. It was not on the coast, nor in the most fertile plains of Italy. But the city sat at a crossing point of the river, where inland routes met maritime access, and it occupied a central position in the Italian peninsula. As Rome expanded, these geographic quirks became advantages. The city was close enough to the sea for trade, but far enough inland to avoid sudden naval attack. From its 7 hills, the Romans gradually extended their influence, and once the empire spanned continents, the city's symbolic weight far outstripped its geography. Rome became the beating heart of an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, its roads radiating outward like spokes of a wheel. "All roads lead to Rome" was not just a proverb, it was a reflection of deliberate planning, with the capital as the gravitational centre of the known world. Constantinople, later Istanbul, shows a ruler's hand even more clearly. Founded by Constantine in the 4th century, it was chosen precisely because of its geography. The city straddled the narrow Bosporus Strait, commanding the passage between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and between Europe and Asia. It was both bridge and barrier, gateway and fortress. The site was easily defensible, with water on 3 sides and strong walls on the 4th. This geography meant control of trade, taxation of shipping, and military dominance over 2 continents. The decision to make Constantinople the new imperial capital shifted the axis of the Roman world eastward. Politics redrew the map, and the city remained a centre of empire for over 1,000 years under both the Byzantines and the Ottomans. Few places illustrate so perfectly how rulers exploit geography to make a statement of permanence. In China, the story of Beijing reflects the same pattern of deliberate choice. Its position in the north of the country placed it close to the frontier with the nomadic steppe peoples, making it strategically useful for defence. By situating the capital there, dynasties such as the Ming and Qing could better control both internal territories and external threats. Yet Beijing was more than a military outpost. It became a city of vast ceremonial power, laid out according to principles of feng shui and Confucian order. The Forbidden City at its heart was not only the emperor's residence, but also a cosmic diagram, symbolizing the center of the world. In this sense, geography was shaped by ideology. The city's location may have been chosen for strategic reasons, but its design projected a vision of political and cosmic harmony. Empires often shifted their capitals to suit their changing needs. The Abbasid caliphs moved from Damascus to Baghdad in the 8th century, positioning themselves at the crossroads of Mesopotamia, closer to Persian influence and the fertile heart of the Islamic world. The Mughal emperors of India shifted their centres from Agra to Delhi, reshaping cities to reflect their power. In Russia, Peter the Great went further still, carving a new city from the marshes of the Baltic coast. St. Petersburg was not merely a settlement, it was a statement. By founding a capital on the edge of Europe, Peter declared Russia's intention to look westward, to join the European powers in trade, culture and politics. Geography was forced into alignment with imperial ambition. Capitals chosen by rulers often outgrew their natural advantages. They endured not because they were the easiest places to live, but because they symbolized the empire itself. The sheer concentration of power, wealth, and administration anchored them in place. To abandon the capital was to admit weakness, so rulers poured resources into keeping them strong. This is why Rome persisted long after its strategic advantages faded, and why Beijing remained the political centre of China for centuries despite shifts in trade routes. The act of choosing a capital also reshaped the regions around it. Roads, canals, and later railways were built to tie the provinces to the centre. Agricultural surpluses were funneled toward the capital to feed its swelling population. Monumental architecture rose to project the might of rulers. Capitals were not just places where laws were written, they were showcases of empire designed to impress both subjects and visitors. The geography of empire radiated outward from the chosen city like ripples in a pond. Yet these capitals also carried enormous weight. To be the centre was to be vulnerable. Rome was sacked more than once. Constantinople endured countless sieges. Beijing faced foreign invasion and internal rebellion. The concentration of resources made them glittering prizes for conquerors. Geography could make them defensible, but no location was impregnable. The very choice to concentrate power in one place ensured that when the city fell, the empire trembled. Despite these risks, rulers returned again and again to the same principle. A strong capital meant a strong empire. Geography was bent to serve politics, and politics in turn left its mark on geography. Consider how the Roman road system, designed to tie distant provinces to the capital, still shapes the landscapes of Europe today, or how the Great Wall of China, built to protect Beijing and its hinterlands, continues to trace the geography of the frontier. Political decisions outlived the rulers who made them, inscribing power into the land itself. There is something both practical and theatrical in these choices. Capitals were centres of administration, but they were also stages for ceremony. Processions, coronations, parades, and rituals gave the impression of stability and permanence. By situating these performances in a carefully chosen location, rulers reinforced the idea that their power was natural, inevitable, and tied to the very geography of the earth. Even in modern times, echoes of this tradition remain. New capitals are still created to symbolize fresh beginnings or to assert control. Brasilia, carved from Brazil's interior, was intended to unify the nation and draw development away from the coast. Abuja in Nigeria and Canberra in Australia were chosen as neutral sites between rival regions. These are reminders that while the age of empires may have passed, the weight of political geography still shapes where nations choose to place their seats of power. When we think of cities and why they form, it is tempting to focus only on rivers, harbours, and fertile soils. Yet the story of empire shows that sometimes a city exists where it does because rulers demanded it, and once they did, the entire landscape bent to their will. Rome, Constantinople, Beijing, each one became more than a city. They were symbols, embodiments of empire, chosen not simply to survive, but to project dominance. The geography of power is never neutral. It is written in capitals that endure for centuries, long after the rulers who chose them have faded into history. Some cities appear as if conjured overnight, born not from fertile valleys or crossroads of trade, but from the glint of something buried deep beneath the earth. When resources are discovered, gold in a stream, coal in a hillside, salt beneath a desert crust, people gather with astonishing speed. The promise of wealth can transform a wilderness into a bustling settlement in a matter of months. Yet just as quickly, when the resource dwindles or fashions change, those same cities can wither, leaving behind ghost towns, slag heaps, and echoes of frantic days gone by. Gold rushes are perhaps the most dramatic example. In the mid-19th century, the discovery of gold in California turned a sleepy outpost at the edge of the United States into a magnet for fortune seekers. San Francisco, once a small settlement of a few hundred, exploded into a city of tens of thousands almost overnight. Ships abandoned in the harbour were left to rot as their crews dashed inland with picks and shovels. The landscape filled with mining camps, rough streets, and hastily built saloons. Few of those prospectors ever struck it rich, but the momentum of population was enough to establish a permanent city that later grew on trade, industry, and finance. Gold provided the spark, even if it was fleeting. The same pattern played out in other corners of the globe. Johannesburg in South Africa rose from the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand in the late 19th century. Within a decade, it had become the largest city in the country, drawing migrants from across Africa and beyond. What began as a mining camp became a metropolis, its streets and suburbs sprawling outward in response to the demands of extraction. Gold dug from deep shafts not only built the city, but also shaped the politics and inequalities that still echo in South Africa today. Salt, though less glamorous, was once even more valuable than gold. In the ancient and medieval world, salt was essential for preserving food, and entire economies revolved around its production and trade. Cities such as Timbuktu and Taghasa in West Africa thrived on the salt caravans that crossed the Sahara. Huge slabs of salt were carried on camelback, traded for gold, ivory and other goods. In Europe, Salzburg literally means salt fortress. Its wealth built on nearby mines that supplied the continent. Markets filled with merchants dealing not in glittering metal, but in the crystals that kept meat edible through long winters. Coal gave rise to another wave of cities, this time in the industrial era. In Britain, towns like Manchester, Newcastle and Sheffield swelled with workers drawn by the promise of wages in the mines and mills. Coal was the black gold of the 19th century, powering steam engines, factories and railways. Settlements clustered around coal fields, their skylines marked by smokestacks and their streets by rows of worker housing. The geography of coal reshaped entire regions, turning rural landscapes into belts of industry. But as with gold towns, the boom carried risks. When seams were exhausted or cleaner fuels emerged, many coal towns faced decline, their economies collapsing along with their pits. Markets and resources were often intertwined. A mine or quarry alone was not enough. There had to be routes to carry the goods away. This is why resource-rich places often gave rise to trading centres, where miners, merchants, and travellers mingled. The city of Potosi in Bolivia, perched high in the Andes, is a striking example. In the 16th century, its silver mines became so productive that the phrase "worth a Potosi" entered European languages as a measure of immense wealth. The city swelled with tens of thousands of people, at one point rivaling the population of European capitals. Its silver fueled the Spanish Empire, but the environmental and human cost was staggering. When the mines declined, so too did the city, though traces of its once dazzling prosperity remain in its churches and plazas. Resource towns often had a fragile quality because their fortunes were tied to a single commodity. A strike of gold or discovery of coal might send thousands rushing in, but the exhaustion of those resources sent thousands more rushing out. Boomtowns left behind skeletons of infrastructure, empty saloons, silent mills, abandoned rail lines. Yet some of these settlements endured by reinventing themselves. San Francisco moved from gold to banking and shipping. Pittsburgh, once a centre of coal and steel, diversified into technology and medicine. Resource wealth may be fickle, but it often lays the groundwork for something more lasting. The cultural fabric of these places was distinctive too. Mining cities tended to be rough, cosmopolitan, and volatile. People arrived from every direction, bringing languages, traditions, and ambitions that clashed and mingled. Markets brimmed with goods from afar, while theatres, gambling halls, and houses of worship sprang up side by side. With sudden wealth came sudden inequality. Some struck fortunes, while others barely scraped by. The intensity of life in resource towns left a mark on their character, even if the prosperity proved temporary. Even salt routes had their own flavour of cosmopolitanism. Caravans linking West Africa to North Africa and the Middle East connected distant regions, and the towns along the way became vibrant trading hubs. Salt traders shared streets with scholars, scribes, and craftsmen. Knowledge moved as surely as goods, and cities like Timbuktu became renowned for their libraries and centres of learning. Here, geography dictated not just economy, but also culture, with the resource acting as the anchor around which intellectual life could flourish. The fragility of resource-driven cities is still visible today. Mining towns in Australia or Canada may thrive during commodity booms and struggle during downturns. Oil-rich cities in the Middle East rise with glittering skylines funded by petroleum, yet face questions about what comes after the wells run dry. History shows that the resource itself may vanish, but the settlements remain, haunted or transformed by their origins. What is striking is how often resource wealth creates not just economic change but also social upheaval. Sudden influxes of wealth destabilize old hierarchies, creating both opportunity and conflict. In gold rushes, lawlessness was common, as towns grew faster than institutions could keep up. In coal cities, tensions between owners and workers sparked strikes and political movements. The geography of mines and markets was never just about extraction. It was about the societies that formed under pressure, as intense as the forces that shaped the minerals underground. In the story of why cities form, resources play the role of the spark. Brilliant, transformative, but often short-lived. Gold, coal, salt, silver, each has pulled humanity into unlikely corners of the earth, inspiring sudden blooms of urban life. Some of those blooms faded, others adapted, but all remind us that the ground beneath our feet can be as decisive as rivers, coasts, or crossroads. Mines and markets may seem ephemeral, yet their legacy is etched in skylines, in trade networks, and in the human drive to chase wealth wherever it might lie hidden. When European ships set sail in the 15th and 16th centuries, they did not just carry sailors, spices, and cannons. They carried a new geography of cities, one that would stamp itself across the globe. Colonization was not only about conquering land, but about reshaping it, projecting power through the very layout of streets, the siting of ports, and the rise of new capitals. The urban world was redrawn, often in stark contrast to the landscapes and cultures that had existed before. Port cities were the first and most visible signs of this imprint. Wherever European ships anchored, settlements grew to service them. Along the Atlantic coast of Africa, towns like Luanda and Dakar emerged as nodes in the brutal transatlantic slave trade. In the Americas, ports such as Havana, Cartagena, and Veracruz became vital waypoints linking colonies to imperial centres. Their harbours bustled with goods and people moving in both directions. Sugar, tobacco, silver, and enslaved Africans one way, manufactured goods, soldiers, and administrators the other. Geography dictated their siting. Deepwater harbours, sheltered bays, and proximity to shipping lanes were prized. Yet their explosive growth was driven by the demands of empire, not by local needs. The colonial port was often a place of striking contrasts. Within its fortified walls stood European architecture, administrative offices and churches, while just beyond sprawled indigenous settlements or slave quarters. The geography of power was visible in stone and brick. In some places the city was literally divided. The European quarter with its wide streets and plazas, the native quarter left unplanned, irregular, and often neglected. Cities became maps of hierarchy, their very structure reinforcing domination. Beyond ports, colonizers also imposed entirely new capitals, planned from scratch to serve imperial interests. In South America, the Spanish founded Lima on the coast of Peru, a city carefully laid out with a central plaza, cathedral, and grid of streets radiating outward. It was designed not only for efficiency, but for symbolism. The plaza represented both spiritual and political authority, with the cathedral and government palace staring at each other across its expanse. The same template was repeated from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, stamping Spanish power onto local geography. The British too left their mark with planned capitals. New Delhi, created in the early 20th century, was a statement of imperial grandeur. Broad avenues, monumental government buildings, and carefully aligned vistas projected authority and control. It was not a city that grew organically. It was a city designed to embody empire. The same can be said for Canberra in Australia or Ottawa in Canada. Capitals chosen and built to balance regional rivalries while maintaining imperial oversight. Geography was no longer simply natural, it became political design, inscribed onto the land by surveyors and architects. The grid was one of the most enduring colonial tools. Europeans favoured it for its order and legibility. In Spanish America, The laws of the Indies in the 16th century laid down precise instructions for how new towns should be built. Streets were to form a grid, centred on a plaza with specific locations for churches, administrative buildings and markets. This uniformity spread across vast territories, meaning that from Quito to Santiago, cities carried the same unmistakable signature. The grid was not just practical, it was ideological. It imposed order where colonizers saw chaos, and it allowed for easy control and taxation. A gridded city could be mapped, managed, and patrolled with far greater ease than an organic settlement of winding lanes. Other powers followed similar patterns. The French, in North America, founded New Orleans with a rectilinear plan, while later in North Africa they imposed boulevards and European-style quarters alongside existing medinas. The Dutch left their imprint on cities like Batavia, today's Jakarta, where canals and straight streets reflected their own urban traditions. In each case, the new layouts often clashed with existing landscapes and lifeways, creating hybrid cities where colonial order rubbed against local reality. Sometimes entire landscapes were transformed to suit imperial purposes. In Brazil, the Portuguese shifted the capital from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro to better defend against attacks and to control the flow of gold from the interior. In Africa, colonial authorities established inland capitals like Nairobi, chosen for their cooler climates and strategic rail connections, rather than for pre-existing settlement patterns. These choices redrew maps, shifting centres of population and power. Nairobi grew from a railway depot into Kenya's largest city, while Pretoria, laid out by Boer settlers and later elevated under British rule, became another symbol of imposed authority. Yet colonial cities were not static monuments. They became dynamic melting pots, where cultures collided and fused. Ports especially were cosmopolitan by necessity, filled with sailors, traders, slaves, and migrants from multiple continents. In places like Havana or Cape Town, the blending of African, European, and indigenous influences created new languages, cuisines, and music. The colonial imprint was heavy, but human creativity seeped through its cracks, giving rise to cultures that were neither wholly European nor wholly local, but something distinct. Still, the imprint of empire often came at a cost. Indigenous urban traditions were disrupted or erased. In the Americas, great cities like Tenochtitlan were razed and rebuilt in European form. The Spanish drained its lakes and constructed Mexico City on its ruins, ignoring the sophisticated hydrological systems that had once supported it. In doing so, they created a city prone to floods and water shortages, problems that persist to this day. Colonial urbanism often disregarded local knowledge, replacing it with imposed order that served imperial needs rather than long-term sustainability. The legacies of these choices are still visible. Many of today's largest cities in Africa, Asia, and the Americas trace their modern layouts to colonial foundations. Grids, plazas, and administrative quarters remain, even as skyscrapers and highways have risen around them. Capitals like Nairobi, Dakar, or Manila continue to bear the marks of the colonial era in their infrastructure and institutions. The geography of empire endures long after the empires themselves have gone. At the same time, post-colonial cities have often reinterpreted these legacies. Former administrative buildings have been repurposed, colonial plazas renamed, and European boulevards filled with local life. Yet the basic geography remains, a reminder that urban landscapes are not only shaped by natural forces, but by centuries of human domination and resistance. The colonial imprint shows us a particular truth about why cities form where they do. Sometimes they grow not because of natural advantages, but because power demands it. Ports were built where ships could dock, capitals where rulers wished to govern, grids where empire wanted order. The result is an urban map that is as much about politics and ideology as about rivers or fertile plains. Even now, when you walk through the plazas of Latin America or the boulevards of former French colonies. You're following the lines first drawn by colonial surveyors. Geography, in these cases, carries the unmistakable handwriting of empire. The 19th century was a time when cities seemed to sprout chimneys instead of trees, and when the air itself became a constant reminder of human ambition. Urban growth had happened before, but never with such speed, scale, or intensity. The force that drew people inward was not rivers or harbours this time, but coalfields, railways, and the promise of work in factories. It was a gravitational pull of industry, and once it began, it reshaped the map of the world. Britain was the starting point. Beneath its rolling hills and green fields lay seams of coal, the fuel that powered steam engines, ironworks, and textile mills. Towns that had once been quiet market centres ballooned into industrial giants. Manchester, for example, transformed almost overnight. Its damp climate proved perfect for spinning cotton, while canals and later railways linked it to coalfields and ports like Liverpool. Within decades, it became known as Cottonopolis, a place where the skyline bristled with mills and the air hung heavy with soot. The population surged as workers poured in from the countryside, trading fresh air for wages and fields for factory floors. The story repeated across Britain. Birmingham became a centre of metalworking, Sheffield for steel, Newcastle for coal, and Glasgow for shipbuilding. Each city owed its explosive growth to the proximity of fuel and raw materials, combined with the new arteries of rail that stitched the landscape together. It was as if the country had been rewired, with steam locomotives carrying both people and goods at unprecedented speeds. Distance shrank, and cities became magnets pulling everything toward them. The same pattern soon spread beyond Britain. In continental Europe, the Ruhr Valley in Germany turned from a cluster of small towns into one of the most industrialised regions in the world. Coal and iron ore lay side by side, a fortunate geological accident that allowed the rapid rise of steelworks and factories. Towns such as Essen and Dortmund expanded as workers arrived from across the country. In France, Lille grew with textiles, while in Belgium, Liège and Charleroi thrived on coal and iron. Across the continent, industrial gravity was irresistible, and cities mushroomed as rural populations drained into their orbit. In the United States, the pull was just as dramatic. The northeastern seaboard saw cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia grow rapidly, but it was the Great Lakes region that became the true industrial powerhouse. Pittsburgh rose on steel, Chicago on meatpacking and railways, Detroit eventually on automobiles. The connection between natural resources and urban expansion was clear. Coal from Pennsylvania, iron ore from Minnesota, and transport via the Great Lakes created a corridor of industry that would dominate for more than a century. Immigrants from Europe and migrants from rural America flooded into these cities, seeking opportunity in landscapes that echoed with machinery. What made these industrial cities different from their predecessors was not just their size, but their character. They were landscapes of smoke and steam, where noise was constant and the air itself seemed to vibrate with activity. Streets were crowded with workers hurrying to shifts, carts laden with coal, and children darting through alleys between looming brick factories. Nights were lit by gas lamps and the fiery glow of furnaces. It was both awe-inspiring and oppressive, a testament to human ingenuity, but also a reminder of the costs it exacted. The gravitational pull of industry was not gentle. It tore people from ancestral lands and thrust them into new rhythms. Rural families who had once worked by the seasons now lived by the factory clock, with its relentless whistles marking time. Houses were built in tight rows near the mills, often cramped and unsanitary. Yet despite the hardships, the city offered something the countryside could not: the chance of steady wages, however meagre, and the faint possibility of social mobility. For many, that was enough to endure the smoke and grime. Transport played a decisive role. Railways not only connected mines to mills, but also extended the reach of cities far beyond their immediate hinterlands. A town could grow into a metropolis if rail lines converged there, funneling goods and people from vast distances. London, already a great city, expanded further as railways poured into its termini, each one a gateway linking the capital to every corner of the island. The same was true for Paris, Berlin, and later Moscow, where railway hubs amplified their centrality and ensured that industrial growth clustered around them. Markets too shaped the destiny of industrial cities. Factories needed not only coal and steel, but consumers. Urban populations themselves became the market, buying the very goods their labour produced. A feedback loop emerged. The more people the city attracted, the more demand it generated, which in turn required more factories and more workers. Growth fed on itself, and cities expanded at dizzying rates. Some doubled their populations within a generation, their boundaries spilling outward in waves of brick terraces and tenement blocks. The human costs were profound. Overcrowding led to disease, pollution to respiratory ailments, and poor sanitation to epidemics. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis stalked the slums of London and Manchester, while similar outbreaks plagued New York and Hamburg. Reformers raised alarms. Governments slowly introduced public health measures, and eventually modern sewage systems and clean water supplies transformed urban life. But in the early years, the industrial city was as much a crucible of suffering as of progress. Despite the hardships, culture flourished in these dense environments. Industrial wealth funded libraries, museums, universities, and theatres. Working-class communities developed strong traditions of solidarity, expressed in unions, clubs, and political movements. The same streets that echoed with the clatter of machinery also rang with debates about justice, representation, and rights. The industrial city became not only a site of economic transformation, but also a laboratory of social change. Globally, industrial gravity pulled new regions into its orbit. In Japan, cities such as Osaka and Yokohama expanded rapidly during the Meiji era as the country modernized and industrialized. In Russia, St. Petersburg and Moscow grew as railways spread across the empire. By the end of the 19th century, industrial cities dotted the world map, each one a testament to the same forces: fuel, transport, and factories combining to concentrate humanity as never before. The legacy of this transformation is still with us. Modern cities may no longer rely on coal or steam, but their shape was forged in the 19th century. The grid of streets, the factory districts, the railway lines slicing through neighbourhoods, all are echoes of that era of rapid expansion. The gravitational pull of industry may have shifted toward finance, technology, and services, but the urban form it created endures. What is striking, looking back, is how suddenly the world turned urban. In a matter of decades, humanity shifted from predominantly rural to increasingly city-bound. Geography that had once anchored people to rivers or plains now tied them to mines and mills. The smoke and steel of the 19th century may have dimmed, but its gravitational force still shapes where we live and how we organise our lives. The industrial city was not merely a product of its time. It was the blueprint for the modern urban age. Look at a map of the world today, and the pattern of the largest cities is striking. They hug the coastlines, straddle river mouths, or line the great trade corridors that bind the global economy together. The modern megacity, those vast urban agglomerations with populations measured in tens of millions, may seem like a new phenomenon, yet their locations still echo the same geographical logic that guided the first settlements. Water, movement, and connection continue to dictate where humanity clusters, only now the scale is far larger and the networks global. Consider Tokyo, often regarded as the world's most populous urban area. It sits on the Kanto Plain, facing Tokyo Bay, a sheltered harbour that has anchored centuries of trade and fishing. The bay provided food, transport, and security long before skyscrapers lined its edge. What makes Tokyo extraordinary today is not only its historic geography, but its modern infrastructure. The city is a hub of bullet trains, expressways, and one of the busiest airports in the world. Its position facing the Pacific links it to global shipping routes, while its domestic networks draw in people and goods from every corner of Japan. Geography offered the starting point, but technology multiplied its reach. Shanghai tells a similar story. Rising at the mouth of the Yangtze River, it commands one of the most fertile and densely populated regions of China. For centuries, the Yangtze provided an inland artery carrying grain, textiles, and people toward the coast. Shanghai's harbour, improved with docks and later container terminals, opened it to the world. In the 20th century, it became a financial and commercial giant, its skyline a symbol of China's integration into global trade. The geography of river and coast created the foundation, while modern corridors of shipping and aviation transformed it into a megacity of global significance. Mumbai, too, owes its size to the sea. The city developed around a series of natural harbours on India's west coast, a convenient point for trade between Europe, Africa, and Asia. British colonial authorities invested heavily in port facilities, and railways linked the hinterland's cotton fields to Mumbai's textile mills and docks. Today, the city sprawls far beyond those colonial routes, but its location still explains much of its growth. It is a port city, an air hub, and a gateway for finance and media, a confluence of old geography and new global flows. Not all megacities sit directly on the coast, but even those inland usually cling to rivers or lie astride trade corridors. Cairo rests along the Nile, its lifeline running through the desert. Kinshasa grows on the banks of the Congo River, which serves as a vital artery for Central Africa. Mexico City, though inland, is linked by highways and airports to both coasts, positioning it as a hub within a continental network. Geography in these cases provides not harbours but centrality, a place where people, goods and information converge. The rise of container shipping in the 20th century added new layers to this geography. Ports like Singapore, Hong Kong and Rotterdam became colossal hubs, handling millions of containers each year. Their strategic positions at maritime choke points turned them into indispensable nodes of global trade. Singapore, perched at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, commands the Strait of Malacca, through which a vast share of the world's oil and manufactured goods pass. Its cityscape of glittering towers and dense housing blocks would not exist without this singular maritime geography. Airports have become the new harbours of the modern age. Cities with major international airports attract business, tourism, and migration at a scale unimaginable in earlier times. Dubai, for instance, has used its geographic position between Europe, Asia, and Africa to transform itself into a global hub. Its airport is among the busiest in the world for international passengers, and its port at Jebel Ali handles vast amounts of cargo. The desert might seem an unlikely place for a megacity, but its location at the crossroads of continents, combined with deliberate investment, has made it thrive. Geography, in this sense, is not only natural but engineered, amplified by human choices. Highways and railways also reinforce the growth of megacities. São Paulo expanded along transport routes linking the Brazilian interior to the coast. Lagos sprawls along highways connecting it to West Africa's regional trade. Jakarta, though plagued by congestion, is still the gravitational centre of Indonesia, tied together by roads, airports and ports. Each of these megacities has grown not just because of population pressure, but because their positions make them indispensable nodes in national and global networks. The scale of today's megacities creates new dynamics. Where once a city of 100,000 seemed immense, now urban areas of 20 million or more are common. These vast settlements generate their own momentum. Once a place passes a certain threshold, it becomes almost self-sustaining. People move there not only for jobs or trade, but because the city itself contains everything: markets, schools, hospitals, culture, and entertainment. Geography may explain their origin, but sheer human mass explains their continuation. Yet the advantages of these locations also bring challenges. Coastal megacities are vulnerable to rising seas and storms. River cities face flooding and water shortages. Transport hubs are choked by congestion. The very geography that made them attractive also exposes them to new risks in an age of climate change and global interdependence. Cities like Jakarta, for instance, are literally sinking under their own weight, forcing governments to consider relocating entire capitals. The geography of the future may yet demand new adjustments. Despite these challenges, the allure of megacities remains powerful. They embody opportunity and connection, a chance to plug into the flow of global life. People continue to flock to them from rural areas, drawn by the gravitational pull of work, education and possibility. The hum of airports, the endless movement of ships, the glow of skyscrapers along a harbour, these are the modern equivalents of the ancient fire circle or the riverbank camp. They represent safety of a different kind, safety in numbers, in networks, in access to the wider world. In the end, today's largest cities are shaped by the same forces that guided the ancients, only amplified by technology and scale. Rivers, coasts and crossroads still matter, but now they are joined by airports, container ports, and global highways of information. The modern megacity is the latest expression of an old truth. Human beings gather where geography offers advantage, and once gathered, they create worlds far greater than the sum of their parts. Standing on the shore of a harbour lit by 1,000 lights, or beneath the flight path of planes descending one after another, it is easy to see how the geography of connection continues to define where cities rise and how they grow. If there is one thread running quietly beneath the story of cities, it is water. Not gold, not stone, not even fertile soil has been so constant a companion to human settlement. Strip away the harbours, the crossroads, the high walls of fortresses, and you find the same essential question: where will the water come from? Without it, no city can thrive for long. With it, even the most unlikely landscapes can sustain generations. In the earliest villages, water meant proximity to a spring or a river. Wells were dug by hand, lined with stone or wood, and kept as carefully as treasure. To draw water was a daily ritual, an act so fundamental that entire communities could rise or fall depending on whether the well held out through the dry season. Some of the oldest surviving structures on Earth are not temples or palaces, but wells. Reminders that before ceremony or grandeur, survival came first. As settlements swelled into towns, water had to be carried further and stored better. The ingenuity of ancient engineers shines most brightly here. Aqueducts are the most dramatic example. Monumental bridges of stone carrying streams across valleys and hillsides to feed thirsty cities. The Romans perfected this craft, building channels that stretched for miles with only the subtlest gradients, so that water flowed steadily without pumps. The aqueducts of Rome brought millions of litres daily, feeding fountains, baths and private homes. To walk through the ruins today is to see not just architecture, but confidence, a civilization announcing that it could bend nature to its will. Elsewhere, other solutions flourished. In Mesopotamia, canals turned floodplains into a carefully managed network of irrigation and supply. In Persia, underground channels called qanats carried water from distant mountains into arid valleys, hidden from evaporation beneath the desert floor. In the Andes, the Inca carved terraces and channels to trap and guide rainfall, making steep slopes bloom with crops. Geography posed challenges, but human persistence found ways to coax water across landscapes. Each city was, in essence, an elaborate conversation with its water source. Reservoirs provided another answer. In India, stepwells combined storage with artistry, descending in ornate staircases to vast underground pools. In Sri Lanka, ancient kings built massive tanks, earthworks that collected monsoon rains and sustained agriculture through dry months. These were not small-scale fixes. They were grand projects that supported entire urban populations. To command water was to command life, and rulers understood that their legitimacy often rested on keeping the fountains flowing and the fields green. The story of canals adds yet another layer. In Venice, canals became the very streets of the city, binding water and settlement so tightly that one cannot imagine one without the other. In China, the Grand Canal linked the fertile south to the political centres of the north, allowing grain to feed millions in Beijing. Amsterdam, with its concentric rings of waterways, turned marshland into a thriving mercantile hub. Canals were not only sources of water but also arteries of movement, doubling as transport routes that fed both stomachs and treasuries. Cities without reliable water often struggled. Petra, that dazzling stone-carved city in Jordan, flourished for centuries because of ingenious systems of cisterns and channels that captured scarce rainfall. But when trade shifted and its water systems faltered, the city declined. Similarly, some ancient Maya cities, despite their architectural brilliance, suffered when prolonged droughts dried reservoirs and cenotes. Water scarcity could unravel centuries of careful building, proving that no walls or palaces could compensate for empty cisterns. Even in the modern age, the same rule applies. Los Angeles rose in a dry basin only because vast aqueducts were built to pull water from distant valleys. Without them, its millions of residents could not drink, wash, or water their lawns. Las Vegas gleams with neon in the desert, but it depends on Lake Mead and the Colorado River, both of which strain under demand. The promise of endless growth is always shadowed by the question of whether the taps will run tomorrow. Cities may now be powered by electricity and wired by fibre optics, but their foundations are still wet. Water has always shaped culture as much as survival. Public fountains became gathering points, places where neighbours met and news spread. Rituals often centred on water, from Roman baths to Islamic ablutions to Hindu festivals along the Ganges. In many cities, to control the supply was also to display power. Monumental fountains in Baroque Rome gushed not merely for utility, but as spectacles of abundance, reminding citizens of the authority that made such marvels possible. Water was both necessity and theatre, practical and symbolic in equal measure. Yet water also reminds cities of their limits. Floods have destroyed as often as droughts have starved. London suffered repeated outbreaks of cholera in the 19th century, traced to contaminated wells and the filthy Thames. Only with modern sewage systems and clean water supplies did the city become truly habitable for millions. The Great Stink of 1858, when the river reeked so badly that Parliament could not sit, drove home the point that no amount of industry or wealth could ignore the centrality of sanitation. To manage water badly was to invite disaster. What is remarkable is how universal this theme remains. Whether in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of South America, or the plains of Europe, the question is always the same: how to secure and sustain water. Cities that solved it endured, those that did not often faded into memory. The ruins of once great places often conceal broken channels, silted reservoirs or forgotten wells, silent reminders of what happens when the flow stops. At the same time, water gives cities a beauty unlike any other element. Think of Istanbul gleaming along the Bosporus, Paris embracing the Seine, or Prague mirrored in the Vltava. Rivers and lakes are not just utilities, they are stages of urban identity, shaping skylines, inspiring poets, and calming the restless gaze of city dwellers. A city without water feels incomplete, as if missing its reflection. So much of human ingenuity has gone into chasing, storing, and sharing this resource that one could describe the history of cities as the history of plumbing. From clay pipes in Mesopotamia to vast dams in the 20th century, each era found new ways to make water flow where people needed it. Yet despite all this effort, the lesson remains humble. Cities survive only as long as their water does. The electric grids, highways, and skyscrapers of today may seem more impressive, But without reservoirs and rivers, they are castles of sand. In every age, water is the quiet architect of settlement. It rarely announces itself with grandeur, but its absence is always devastating. Wells, aqueducts, canals, cisterns, reservoirs, these are the unsung structures that have kept cities alive across millennia. Behind every glittering skyline is the simple assurance that when a tap is turned, water will flow. That, more than monuments or walls, is what allows cities to endure. Some of the most intriguing cities do not sit at the heart of empires or beside vast rivers, but instead emerge where lines are drawn, lines that often cannot be seen. Borders, frontiers, and cultural edges may appear invisible to the eye, yet they carry immense weight. Where languages change, where states meet, where customs overlap, cities often sprout as brokers between worlds. Geography in these cases is not only about mountains and coastlines, but about the meeting of human identities. Borders are curious things. They can divide people who share the same landscape, or unite those who would otherwise be far apart. For cities, a border can be both a challenge and an opportunity. Take Geneva. Perched at the edge of Switzerland, close to both France and Italy, it became a natural gathering point for trade, diplomacy, and culture. Its location at a cultural frontier gave it a cosmopolitan air, drawing refugees, merchants, and thinkers across centuries. Invisible boundaries here acted less like walls and more like magnets. In other cases, borders became places of exchange because they restricted movement. Cities at checkpoints flourished by servicing travellers who had to stop. The Hanseatic town of Lübeck, for instance, sat at the northern edge of German principalities, controlling trade into the Baltic. Merchants paid tolls, ships were inspected, and warehouses filled with goods waiting for clearance. The geography of control gave Lübeck its prosperity. Later, similar dynamics would shape Calais on the English Channel or Gibraltar at the mouth of the Mediterranean, places where the narrowness of passage turned into opportunities for cities to grow. Cultural boundaries could be just as powerful. Istanbul, straddling Europe and Asia, is the most famous example. Its geography at the Bosporus gave it military and economic importance, but equally significant was its role as a cultural hinge. Byzantine, Ottoman, Greek, Turkish, Islamic and Christian traditions all mingled there. The city thrived because it sat at a frontier of worlds, not wholly one or the other, but a synthesis of both. Border cities often become laboratories of culture, places where food, language, and architecture borrow across boundaries. The Americas provide vivid illustrations of how invisible lines foster visible cities. Tijuana, on the border of Mexico and the United States, grew precisely because of its position. Factories, tourism, and migration all flowed through it, creating a dynamic urban life distinct from either San Diego to the north or the Mexican hinterlands to the south. Ciudad Juarez on the Rio Grande tells a similar story, expanding with cross-border trade and the movement of people. These cities embody the push and pull of borderlands, zones of opportunity, tension, and creativity all at once. Sometimes borders are political, other times natural. Mountain passes, deserts, and rivers often mark the edge of states. Cities that grew in such locations frequently acted as guardians as well as traders. Aachen in Germany, once the capital of Charlemagne, lay near the boundaries of his empire and served as a ceremonial and political frontier. Strasbourg on the Rhine has long been a prize contested between France and Germany, its culture shaped by centuries of shifting allegiance. Here the geography of frontiers meant that cities became both bridges and battlegrounds. In Africa, colonial borders carved with little regard for existing cultures created new urban dynamics. Cities such as Kinshasa and Brazzaville face each other across the Congo River, capitals of different nations yet sharing geography, history, and cultural ties. Their twin existence reflects how invisible lines of empire impose new realities, and how cities adapted by finding roles in trade, politics, and identity. Religious and cultural boundaries also left their mark. Cities on pilgrimage routes often grew where one tradition faded into another. In medieval Spain, Toledo became known as the City of Three Cultures, where Christian, Muslim and Jewish communities lived side by side. Its location in central Iberia placed it at the edge of shifting frontiers during the Reconquista, and its intellectual life flourished as scholars translated texts across languages and traditions. The blending of worlds was not always peaceful, but it produced an enduring cultural richness. The economic opportunities of borders are sometimes counterintuitive. Where states impose tariffs or restrictions, cities often grow by providing ways around them. Smuggling routes, contraband markets, and informal exchanges flourish in frontier towns. Along the border between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, the city of Ciudad del Este grew into a hub of trade, much of it unofficial, precisely because of its position at a tri-border zone. Geography and legality intertwined, creating a city whose energy comes from exploiting the seams between systems. Invisible boundaries can also be linguistic. Montreal, for instance, sits at the divide between French-speaking and English-speaking Canada. The city's dual character has shaped its politics, culture and identity for centuries. It thrives on this tension, producing art, literature and institutions that reflect its role as a mediator between worlds. Similarly, Brussels finds itself linguistically divided between French and Flemish, yet its international role as the seat of the European Union demonstrates how borderlands can transform into centres of global importance. Not all frontier cities are vast. Some remain small but vital, existing as way stations between zones. Border towns often have outsized importance relative to their size, serving as checkpoints, markets, or diplomatic outposts. Even a modest settlement can thrive if it sits at the one bridge across a river marking a boundary, or at the sole pass through a mountain range. Geography funnels movement, and where movement is forced to converge, a city can take root. There is a paradox at the heart of such places. Borders are drawn to divide, yet in dividing they also connect. They make people aware of difference, and in doing so they create points of contact. Cities at borders are rarely tranquil, yet they are often vibrant, pulsing with the energy of exchange. They may be contested, even fought over, but they are also indispensable, because someone must manage the crossing. If rivers and harbours gave rise to cities by providing resources, borders did so by providing opportunity at the edges of systems. Invisible lines on maps became visible in markets, customs, houses, and fortresses. Over time, these grew into cities with their own rhythms, shaped less by the soil beneath them than by the people passing through. The geography of invisible boundaries reminds us that cities are not only products of physical landscapes, but also of human imagination. A line agreed in a treaty, a cultural shift across a valley, a religious frontier marked by pilgrimage routes. These can be as decisive as mountains or rivers in determining where people gather, and where people gather, cities grow, humming with the negotiations of life lived at the edge. Cities often feel eternal. Their walls seem permanent, their monuments timeless, their streets destined to endure. Yet history shows that cities can be surprisingly fragile. Some shift location entirely, some vanish into ruins swallowed by jungle or desert, and some are rebuilt from scratch in new places. Geography is not only about where cities rise, but also why they sometimes fall or wander. Petra is one of the most haunting examples. Carved into rose-red cliffs in what is now Jordan, it flourished for centuries as the capital of the Nabatean kingdom. Its wealth came from its position along caravan routes linking Arabia to the Mediterranean. Ingenious water channels and cisterns allowed it to thrive in an arid valley. But when trade routes shifted to the sea and Roman power grew elsewhere, Petra's importance declined. Eventually the city was abandoned, left to crumble into silence. For centuries it lay hidden, known mainly to local Bedouins, until rediscovered by European explorers in the 19th century. The ruins stand today as a reminder that even the most breathtaking cities are vulnerable to the currents of geography and commerce. Angkor in Cambodia tells a different story. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, it was one of the largest urban centres in the world, a sprawling city of temples, canals and reservoirs. Angkor Wat, its most famous monument, is only a fragment of a once vast metropolis. The city's strength lay in its mastery of water, with massive barrays, or reservoirs, that sustained rice cultivation. But as populations grew, the water system may have become overstretched. Droughts, combined with invasions and shifting trade patterns, weakened the city. By the 15th century, Angkor had declined, and the Khmer court moved south to Phnom Penh. The jungle crept in, slowly reclaiming the stone towers. For modern visitors, Angkor is a marvel, but its ruins whisper of how a city can fade when its delicate balance with geography falters. Sometimes cities move not through decline, but by deliberate choice. Brasilia in Brazil is a striking case. In the mid-20th century, the Brazilian government decided to relocate the capital from coastal Rio de Janeiro to the country's interior. The aim was to promote development inland and to symbolize a modern, unified Brazil. A new city was designed and built in just a few years, with sweeping boulevards, monumental buildings, and a layout in the shape of an airplane. Geography here was political, imposed by decision rather than natural necessity. Brasilia's success has been mixed. It fulfilled its role as a capital, but has often been criticised for its artificial feel and social inequalities. Still, it demonstrates that cities can be transplanted wholesale, born anew through vision and willpower. Other capitals have shifted in similar ways. In Nigeria, Abuja was built to replace Lagos as the capital, chosen for its central location and neutrality among ethnic groups. In Myanmar, Naypyidaw was constructed to replace Yangon, with vast highways and administrative districts carved out of farmland. These relocations reveal how rulers sometimes move cities like chess pieces, repositioning them to suit political or strategic needs. Whether the people follow willingly is another question, and often the new capitals struggle to acquire the vibrancy of the old. Wars and disasters have also forced cities to move. In the Middle Ages, many towns abandoned vulnerable riverbanks for more defensible hilltops after repeated invasions. Earthquakes and floods sometimes destroyed settlements so completely that survivors rebuilt on safer ground nearby. Lisbon, after the catastrophic earthquake of 1755, was reconstructed with new streets and squares, its geography reshaped in response to disaster. The resilience of urban life meant that even when cities moved, the impulse to rebuild was almost always there. But not all moves succeed. Some attempts to build new cities falter, leaving behind half-finished streets and empty plazas. Ghost capitals such as Ciudad Verde in South America, or planned towns abandoned after colonial ambitions faded, stand as reminders that geography cannot always be forced to obey vision. Without the steady pull of trade, resources, or population, cities cannot thrive, no matter how carefully planned. Why do some cities endure while others fade? Part of the answer lies in adaptability. Cities that reinvent themselves, shifting from trade to industry, from river commerce to rail, from local markets to global finance, manage to survive. London, Paris and Beijing have all reinvented themselves multiple times. Cities that rely on a single factor, like Petra's caravans or Potossi's silver, risk collapse once that factor vanishes. Geography provides opportunities, but it is flexibility that sustains them. Culture and symbolism also play a role. Jerusalem endured endless sieges and occupations, yet never vanished, because its sacred significance outweighed the challenges of its geography. Rome survived the collapse of its empire, reinventing itself as a spiritual capital, even after its political dominance faded. Cities with deep cultural meaning often persist, even when their material advantages decline. There is something both melancholy and inspiring about cities that move or vanish. Their ruins remind us that human achievements, no matter how grand, are subject to time and change. Yet the act of rebuilding or relocating also shows resilience. Humanity is endlessly resourceful, able to carve new cities from jungle, desert or plain when old ones fail. Walk through the stone streets of Angkor or the silent canyons of Petra, and it is tempting to see only loss. But look closer, and you see continuity, the persistence of people, the capacity to begin again elsewhere. Brasilia's shining modernist avenues, Abuja's central boulevards, Naypyida's vast squares. These are heirs to the same impulse, the belief that geography can be reshaped to fit human needs. In the end, cities are not fixed points, but living organisms. They grow, contract, shift, and sometimes migrate entirely. Their fates are bound to the land beneath them, but also to the choices of those who build them. When they move, they remind us that permanence is an illusion, and that the story of settlement is not only about where cities rise, but about how they change, fade, and reappear. The stones of Petra, the towers of Angkor, the grids of Brasilia, each is a different verse in the same long poem, telling us that cities, like people, must sometimes wander to survive. Cities have always pulled people toward them, but in the modern age the attraction is less about water or walls and more about dreams. They are magnets of opportunity, glowing with the promise of work, education and culture. The countryside may offer space and familiarity, but cities offer the possibility of transformation, the chance to become something different, or at least to try. The gravitational force that once came from rivers and harbours now comes from aspiration. Employment is the most obvious draw. From the 19th century onwards, factories lured rural families into smoky towns, where wages, however modest, meant independence. Today the pattern continues, though the industries have changed. Young people move to cities for jobs in finance, technology, entertainment, and countless services that cannot flourish in remote villages. A city concentrates economic activity, creating an ecosystem where opportunities multiply. Even if a particular job is lost, another may be found, and the churn itself becomes part of the attraction. Cities, for all their competition, offer more options than most rural landscapes ever could. Education follows closely. Cities are often home to universities, schools and training centres that cannot be replicated in every small town. The promise of learning draws students from across regions and even continents. Once they arrive, many stay, pulled into the urban orbit by careers or relationships forged there. In this way, cities constantly renew themselves, filling with the energy of youth seeking knowledge. The clustering of educational institutions also fuels innovation, as ideas cross-pollinate between disciplines and cultures. Silicon Valley may be famous for its startups, but its origins lie in the concentration of universities and research centres that seeded its growth. Culture adds another irresistible layer. A village may have traditions, but cities offer theatres, galleries, concerts, cinemas, and festivals on a scale that is impossible elsewhere. The density of population sustains artists and performers who in turn enrich the city with creativity. Paris in the 19th century, New York in the 20th, and Seoul in the 21st all demonstrate how cultural vibrancy feeds on itself. People arrive for work or study, but they stay for the energy of cafes, music halls, clubs and exhibitions. Culture makes the city not only functional, but alive. The human geography of aspiration also explains the growth of migrant communities within cities. People leave their countries in search of better futures, and cities provide the first foothold. Chinatowns, Little Italys and other enclaves sprang up as migrants clustered together for support, while simultaneously contributing to the diversity that defines urban life. London, Toronto and Sydney are examples of cities where waves of migration have layered one culture upon another, creating a patchwork of languages and cuisines. For the individual, the city represents possibility. For the community, it represents survival and growth in a new land. Another dimension is connectivity. In a city, you are closer to networks, not only physical, like railways and airports, but also social and professional. Careers often depend as much on who you know as on what you know, and cities provide the density of connections that can open doors. A chance meeting in a cafe, a neighbour who works in a relevant field, or a friend of a friend can alter a life's trajectory. These serendipitous encounters happen more often where people are packed together. The geography of density breeds opportunity. Cities also promise anonymity, which is its own kind of opportunity. In a small village, everyone knows everyone's history. In a city, a person can reinvent themselves. The anonymity of crowds allows freedom to experiment with identity, career, and relationships. This can be liberating, especially for those who felt constrained by tradition or expectation in smaller communities. Cities offer not only economic mobility, but social and personal mobility too. Of course, the pull of cities comes with challenges. The very density that creates opportunities also generates competition, inequality, and stress. Housing can be scarce and expensive, jobs precarious, and public services stretched thin. Yet even with these drawbacks, the flow of migration into cities rarely stops. The chance of success, however slim, outweighs the certainty of stagnation elsewhere. The gamble is part of the allure, and history shows that countless people are willing to take it. The growth of megacities in the developing world illustrates this vividly. In Lagos, Dhaka, or Manila, millions arrive each year, drawn by the hope of jobs and education, even as infrastructure struggles to keep pace. Informal settlements and crowded neighbourhoods spring up, filling with the energy of new arrivals. The conditions may be difficult, but the alternative, remaining in rural poverty, seems less promising. For many, the city represents not luxury but survival, a place where the possibility of change is at least within reach. Technology has not diminished the gravitational pull of cities, despite predictions that remote work or digital networks would make location irrelevant. Instead, cities have become even more important as hubs of innovation and collaboration. The internet may connect people across continents, but physical proximity still matters. Ideas flow more easily when people bump into one another, and entire industries cluster in specific cities because the benefits of being together outweigh the costs. Silicon Valley, Hollywood, and Wall Street exist not just because of technology, but because geography still concentrates talent. Even leisure and lifestyle play a role. Cities promise restaurants with global cuisines, nightlife that never ends, and shopping streets filled with variety. They also offer parks, museums, and architecture that enrich daily life. These amenities are not merely luxuries. They're part of the gravitational pull that makes city living attractive. A student may arrive for university, a worker for a job, but both may stay because the city offers richness and variety that smaller places cannot. There is something timeless in this pull. The ancient farmer moving to Uruk for temple work, the medieval apprentice travelling to London for a trade, the modern graduate catching a train to New York or Beijing, all share the same impulse. The city embodies chance. It is where life can change, where fortunes might be made, where horizons widen. Geography provides the stage, but it is human desire that fills it. The gravity of opportunity explains why, even in the face of congestion, pollution, or high costs, cities continue to swell. They're not only centres of economy or politics, but engines of possibility. To step into a city is to step into a field of potential outcomes, each one promising something new. That is why cities remain irresistible, why people keep streaming into them from countryside and across oceans. They may not always find what they hoped for, but the hope itself is enough to sustain the journey. In the end, the geography of aspiration is as real as any river or mountain. It cannot be seen on a map, but it shapes the world just as powerfully. Cities thrive not only because of their physical location, but because they hold the dreams of those who arrive. And as long as people continue to chase those dreams, the gravity of opportunity will keep pulling humanity toward the lights of the city. The land itself leaves fingerprints on every city. Beneath the noise of traffic and the sprawl of suburbs, the bones of the earth quietly guide where streets bend, where neighborhoods cluster, and where skylines rise. Valleys, plains, ridges, and coasts may seem like neutral scenery, but they are the invisible architect of urban form. The geology underfoot and the topography all around shape how a city grows, often in ways unnoticed by the people who live there. Plains have always been hospitable ground for settlement. Flat land makes construction easier, farming more productive, and travel less strenuous. The great cities of Mesopotamia thrived because the broad plains between the Tigris and Euphrates allowed irrigation and agriculture on a grand scale. In modern times, cities like Chicago benefited from the openness of the prairie, which offered space for a grid of streets, sprawling suburbs, and endless railway lines. Plains encourage expansion in all directions, creating cities that spread wide and low rather than tall and compressed. Valleys tell a different story. When cities grow along valleys, their shape often mirrors the contours of the land. Think of Los Angeles, stretched across a basin framed by mountains, or Mexico City, sprawling within a highland valley once filled by a lake. Valleys provide shelter, fertile soils, and water, but they also constrain. Roads, railways, and neighborhoods hug the valley floor or climb cautiously up the sides. Air circulation can become trapped, leading to smog in modern times, while floods can wreak havoc when rivers overflow. Yet the advantages outweigh the drawbacks. Valleys focus movement, funneling trade and travel along narrow corridors, and where corridors converge, cities often bloom. Mountains impose limits that cities learn to navigate. In places like Kathmandu or La Paz, settlements cling to steep slopes, their streets zigzagging in defiance of gravity. Building in such places requires ingenuity, terracing hillsides, constructing switchback roads, and adapting architecture to uneven ground. The result is often breathtaking. Cities that grow in mountainous terrain feel like sculpted landscapes, part human, part geological. At the same time, mountains offer protection and identity. A city framed by peaks seems anchored to its setting, inseparable from the backdrop that defines it. Volcanoes bring their own peculiar influence. Naples, Quito, and Manila all sit in the shadow of fiery mountains. The soil created by volcanic activity is incredibly fertile, drawing farmers who then draw markets and cities. Yet the very forces that nourish also threaten. Naples lies within reach of Vesuvius, famous for burying Pompeii. Quito endures tremors and eruptions, while Manila has lived with repeated devastation. The geography of volcanoes is a gamble. Rich soils and strategic locations paired with looming danger. People accept the risk because the rewards are immediate and tangible, and over time the presence of the volcano becomes woven into the city's identity. Coasts shape cities in subtler but equally powerful ways. A curved bay may dictate where docks and quays are built. A peninsula may limit expansion, forcing the city either inland or upward. Rio de Janeiro is a prime example. Hemmed in by mountains and sea, its neighbourhoods scattered among hills and beaches. The shape of its coastline defines its layout, giving it a character unlike cities built on open plains. San Francisco, too, reveals how coasts and hills combine. Its famous steep streets follow ridges, while its harbour dictated where industry clustered. Geography writes the first draft, and human planning merely edits. Geology beneath the surface can also steer urban form. Cities built on limestone may exploit natural springs and caves, while those on granite enjoy solid foundations for heavy construction. Conversely, cities on alluvial soils or reclaimed wetlands struggle with instability. Mexico City, built on the drained bed of a lake, continues to sink because the soft ground compacts under the weight of the modern buildings. Venice rests on wooden piles driven into mud, a precarious balance between geology and ingenuity. Every skyscraper, subway tunnel, and bridge must reckon with what lies below. Rivers carve their influence into the outline of cities. Not only do they provide water, but their meanders dictate where roads can cross and neighbourhoods form. Paris hugs the Seine, London the Thames, Cairo the Nile. Bridges become focal points, attracting markets, theatres, and public squares. Over time, these river crossings often evolve into the symbolic centres of urban life. The river shapes the rhythm of the city, splitting it into left banks and right banks, north shores and south shores, each with its own character. Even the invisible processes of geology can leave lasting marks. Earthquake zones demand resilience, forcing cities like Tokyo or San Francisco to build with engineering that respects the restless crust beneath them. Floodplains may offer fertile ground but expose cities to recurring disaster, as seen in Dhaka or New Orleans. The resilience of urban populations often masks how much these risks define their lives. Geography is not always a silent partner. Sometimes it is a constant reminder of vulnerability. The spread of modern cities still reflects these ancient constraints. Highways trace the flattest routes, airports demand vast expanses of level land, and suburban growth prefers easy gradients. The topography of a region continues to decide which districts grow rapidly and which remain isolated. In hilly cities, neighbourhoods can remain divided for centuries simply because of steep slopes or ridges. In flatter places, the grid stretches endlessly, erasing distance with asphalt. There is also a psychological element. Cities shaped by dramatic landscapes often become icons, their geography inseparable from their identity. Think of Cape Town beneath Table Mountain, or Seattle framed by Mount Rainier and Puget Sound. These natural landmarks become part of the urban imagination, symbols of place as much as any cathedral or palace. The shape of the land influences not only where cities grow, but how they are perceived and remembered. What is most fascinating is how adaptable humanity has been in responding to these challenges. Engineers cut tunnels through mountains, dredge harbours, and reclaim land from the sea. Skyscrapers rise on swamps thanks to deep foundations, while entire hillsides are stabilised with concrete and steel. Yet even with all this technology, the imprint of geology and topography remains. The modern skyline still follows the contours of the land, bending to valleys, pausing at coasts or clustering on ridges of solid rock. In the end, the shape of the land is the quiet compass of urban growth. It does not shout, but it guides. Plains invite sprawl, valleys concentrate, mountains confine, volcanoes tempt and terrify, coasts cradle and constrain. Beneath every street map is another map, older and deeper, drawn by rivers, tectonics and erosion. To understand a city fully is to look beyond its buildings and into the contours of the earth itself. The land was there first, and it continues to shape the places where humanity gathers, reminding us that all our constructions rest on the foundations of geology's patient hand. Climate has always whispered in the ear of settlement, shaping not only where people could survive, but also where they would thrive. Cities are, at their core, experiments in concentration. Thousands or millions of people packed together, reliant on the same resources. For such density to work, the climate must cooperate. Temperature, rainfall, and wind are not mere background conditions. They are the stage upon which urban life is possible. When the weather tips too far toward extremes, the experiment becomes harder to sustain. It is no accident that many of the world's great cities lie in temperate zones. Mild winters and manageable summers allow people to work, trade, and build without constant struggle against the elements. Paris, London, and New York all benefit from climates that, while occasionally damp or chilly, rarely plunge into unbearable extremes. Agriculture in surrounding regions supports large populations, and water supplies are reliable. The climate provides enough comfort to allow energy to be directed toward culture, politics, and innovation, rather than sheer survival. Rainfall, too, matters enormously. cities flourish where precipitation sustains crops but does not drown them. Too much rain, and settlements face flooding, mud, and disease. Too little, and fields wither and reservoirs dry. The balance is delicate, yet countless civilizations have depended on it. Monsoon regions, such as South Asia for example, support dense populations because the rains, however disruptive, deliver life to the soil. Cities like Mumbai and Dhaka exist because of this seasonal rhythm, even if the floods test their resilience year after year. Temperature shapes urban history in subtler ways. Heat can be a challenge, especially when coupled with humidity. Cities in tropical climates such as Bangkok or Lagos must contend with oppressive warmth, monsoon rains, and diseases that thrive in such environments. Yet they grow regardless, adapting with architecture that encourages airflow, shaded streets, and eventually modern cooling systems. Cold, on the other hand, can limit growth more directly. The further north or south one travels into the high latitudes, the fewer great cities appear. Vast areas of Siberia or the Canadian tundra remain sparsely populated, not because they lack space, but because human bodies and infrastructure struggle against long winters and frozen ground. Deserts present a similar barrier. The arid climate of the Sahara or the Arabian Peninsula makes large-scale settlement nearly impossible without access to reliable water. Cities such as Cairo and Marrakesh survived by clinging to rivers or oases, while others relied on caravan trade to justify their existence. In the modern era, technology has allowed desert cities to grow far beyond their natural limits. Dubai, Las Vegas, and Phoenix all flourish where rainfall is scarce, sustained by imported water, air conditioning, and energy-intensive infrastructure. These are feats of engineering and wealth, but they highlight the degree to which climate remains a constant adversary. Winds also leave their mark, though less visibly. In some regions, prevailing winds bring cooling breezes, making otherwise hot climates tolerable. In others, they funnel dust, storms, or icy blasts that discourage settlement. The Mistral in southern France, the Sirocco in North Africa, and the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean have all influenced where people built and how they lived. Wind shapes not only comfort but also trade. For sailing ships once depended entirely on these patterns. Cities along the Indian Ocean littoral grew precisely because the monsoon winds made predictable voyages possible, linking East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia in a vast maritime network. When we look at the global distribution of cities, the pattern is clear. Few large ones lie in the world's driest deserts, coldest tundras, or highest mountains. Most cluster in the middle latitudes, where climates are relatively moderate. Yet of course there are exceptions. Humans are stubborn creatures, and where wealth, faith, or strategic necessity demands it, cities appear even in the harshest environments. Take Yakutsk in Siberia, often cited as the coldest city on Earth. Winter temperatures plunge below -40 degrees Celsius, and the ground is permanently frozen. Yet more than 300,000 people live there, drawn by mineral wealth, diamonds, gold, and coal. Buildings stand on stilts to avoid melting the permafrost, and life continues despite the extremes. Climate would suggest emptiness, but resources provide a reason to endure. Or consider Lima in Peru, a city of millions that receives almost no rainfall. Its location on the Pacific coast might seem inhospitable, yet the Humboldt Current offshore moderates temperatures, while rivers descending from the Andes provide enough water for survival. Similarly, cities in the Middle East such as Riyadh or Abu Dhabi exist in deserts only because modern technology delivers water and cools the air. Without desalination plants and air conditioning, their scale would be unimaginable. Even ancient cities defied climate's dictates when the stakes were high. The Nabateans built Petra in a desert valley, harnessing every drop of rainfall with channels and cisterns. The ancestral Puebloans constructed cliff dwellings in the arid American Southwest, supported by careful irrigation. These societies thrived for centuries, though often precariously, until shifts in climate tip the balance and force decline or abandonment. What makes climate such a decisive factor is that it influences not only comfort but the stability of resources. Agriculture depends on predictable seasons, and cities depend on agriculture. Where rainfall is erratic or temperatures swing violently, surpluses are harder to maintain. Cities, with their dense populations, are vulnerable to shortages. History is filled with examples of urban decline triggered by droughts or cold spells, from the collapse of Maya centers in Central America to the struggles of medieval Europe during the Little Ice Age. Modern technology has given cities tools to resist climate more effectively. Dams, irrigation, heating and cooling, but it has not erased the challenge. Climate change is already reshaping urban futures, threatening coastal megacities with rising seas and intensifying heat waves in places where populations are already dense. The same forces that once limited ancient settlement patterns continue to exert their influence, only now on a planetary scale. There is also a psychological element to climate. People are drawn to pleasant environments, Mediterranean warmth, ocean breezes, mild summers. Cities such as Barcelona, Sydney or Cape Town are admired not only for their culture and history, but also for their comfortable climates. Visitors and residents alike remark on the quality of life, which is inseparable from the weather. Comfort breeds attachment, and attachment helps cities endure. The role of climate in urban life often goes unnoticed, overshadowed by politics, economics, or culture. Yet every paved street and glass tower rests upon the simple fact that the air outside is survivable, the water drinkable, and the seasons reliable enough to sustain food. Where those conditions falter, cities must either fight against them or fade. When we ask why so few great cities rise in deserts or tundra, the answer lies in this balance of comfort. Humans seek places where life can be sustained with less struggle, where the environment does not constantly conspire against them. But when necessity, faith, or ambition demands, people build anyway, proving that aspiration can sometimes overcome even the harshest climates. The story of cities is thus the story of compromise between human will and the rhythms of temperature, rainfall, and wind. Wherever that compromise holds, cities grow. Where it fails, ruins remain, testifying to the power of climate as the quiet arbiter of comfort and survival. In earlier ages, the destiny of a city was tied closely to its soil, its river, or its harbour. Geography seemed to dictate location with an almost unbreakable grip. But in the modern world, the rules have shifted. Railways, highways, and now the internet have loosened the bonds of physical terrain, creating a new geography of networks and nodes. Where once where meant a bend in the river or a fertile plain, today it can mean a place connected by fibre optic cables, jet routes, or superhighways. The idea of location has been stretched, reframed, and sometimes transformed entirely. The arrival of the railway in the 19th century was perhaps the first major revolution. Suddenly, a city did not have to sit on a navigable river or near a seaport to thrive. Steel rails stitched vast territories together, shrinking distance and altering trade. Towns that had once been isolated could flourish if a railway junction passed through them, while older centres without access often declined. Chicago is the quintessential case. Its position at the edge of the Great Lakes was already useful, but when railways converged there, it became the beating heart of America's transport system. Grain, cattle, and goods flowed through in every direction, and the city ballooned from a frontier town to a metropolis. The iron web redefined geography, elevating some places and bypassing others. Highways in the 20th century extended this transformation. With the rise of the automobile and the truck, cities grew along asphalt corridors, sprawling outward in ways unimaginable before. Los Angeles is perhaps the archetype. A vast expanse of neighborhoods and suburbs stitched together by freeways. Its growth was less about a central river or harbor than about the flow of cars across interchanges and boulevards. Highways blurred the distinction between city and countryside, making it possible for people to live miles from where they worked, shop in distant malls, and commute across regions. The geography of proximity gave way to the geography of mobility. Air travel pushed this even further. Airports became the new gateways, rivaling harbours as engines of urban growth. Cities like Atlanta or Dubai owe much of their prominence to their airports. Atlanta is not a coastal port, nor is it the largest manufacturing hub, yet it sits at the centre of the busiest airport in the world, making it a crossroads of people and commerce. Dubai transformed from a modest trading town into a global hub largely by leveraging its position between continents, turning its airport into a bridge linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. Airports made where less about soil and water and more about global reach. Then came the digital revolution, which shifted the question of location yet again. Fibre optic cables, satellites, and server farms have created a world where information moves almost without regard to distance. A startup in Bangalore can work seamlessly with clients in London, while a student in Nairobi attends lectures streamed from Boston. In some ways, the internet seems to dissolve geography, making location irrelevant. Yet in practice, it creates new kinds of nodes. Cities with strong digital infrastructure, fast connections, data centres, skilled workforces become magnets for investment and talent. Silicon Valley's rise is not just about Californian sunshine. It is about being the densest node in a global digital network. This new geography of connectivity has changed the criteria for success. A place no longer needs to sit on a river delta or at a mountain pass. It needs to sit on a fibre backbone or a major flight corridor. The meaning of strategic location has shifted, but the principle remains the same. Cities thrive when they connect. The physical geography has not disappeared. Ports, rivers, and plains still matter, but the overlay of transport and digital networks adds new dimensions. A city is now as much defined by its connections as by its surroundings. What is striking is how these networks amplify each other. Railways still matter, moving freight across continents. Highways carry goods to ports, which in turn link to global shipping. Airports complement seaports, funneling high-value cargo and passengers. Digital networks tie it all together, allowing just-in-time logistics, financial transactions, and remote coordination. Cities at the intersection of these systems become powerhouses, even if their natural geography is modest. Singapore, Rotterdam, Hong Kong, and Frankfurt illustrate this perfectly. Not vast in land area, but immense in influence because they are nodal points where multiple networks converge. The human experience of the city changes too. Where once people gathered in markets by the river, today they gather in airports, train stations, and online forums. A city's rhythm is marked by flight schedules and traffic flows as much as by tides or harvests. Commuters spend hours on highways, while others work remotely yet remain tied to urban networks through video calls and shared platforms. The very notion of belonging to a place has been altered. People can live physically in one location while economically and socially tied to another. Still, the new geography of networks is not entirely free from the old. Digital infrastructure often follows existing transport routes, with fibre cables laid along railways or under shipping lanes. Airports flourish in cities that were already hubs of trade. In this way, modern connectivity layers itself atop ancient patterns, reinforcing rather than erasing them. London, for instance, was once important because of the Thames. Now it is important because of Heathrow and global finance, but the continuity is clear. Geography evolves, but it rarely vanishes. There are also inequalities in this networked world. Cities with strong infrastructure and resources become ever more central, while those without risk being left behind. A village without reliable electricity cannot compete, no matter how brilliant its people may be. This divide shapes migration and opportunity, pushing people toward nodal cities that can plug them into wider systems. The gravitational pull of opportunity, once tied to farmland or mines, is now tied to servers and runways. Even culture has been reshaped by this nodal geography. Film industries cluster in Hollywood, Bollywood and Seoul, not just by chance, but because of networks of talent, distribution and technology. Music flows from Nashville or Lagos, because those cities connect artists to global audiences. Digital platforms amplify local creativity, yet the infrastructure that supports them is still clustered in certain cities. The internet may feel borderless, but its backbone has addresses. What does this mean for the idea of where? It means that the map of cities is no longer read solely in terms of rivers, mountains or fertile plains. It is read in terms of nodes, corridors and flows. To thrive today, a city must connect outward, whether by container ships, flight schedules or high-speed internet cables. The world has become a mesh of interlinked places, and the cities that dominate are those most deeply entangled in its threads. And yet there is a paradox here. For all the talk of digital networks dissolving geography, people still crowd into physical cities. Remote work exists, but innovation still clusters. The buzz of being together, the serendipity of shared cafes and offices, remains irreplaceable. Cities remain physical as well as digital nodes, grounded in soil but plugged into the world. The story of networks and nodes is thus not about the end of geography, but about its transformation. Railways, highways, airports and the internet have all stretched the meaning of where, turning location into something layered and dynamic. A city is no longer simply where it stands, but where it connects. And in a world where connections are everything, the true measure of a city lies not only in its monuments or skyline, but in the invisible lines of movement and information that tie it into the wider web of humanity. It can seem almost reckless that so many of the world's greatest cities stand in places nature repeatedly punishes. They rise on floodplains that swell and drown, along earthquake faults that tremble and break, or at the feet of volcanoes that brood with fire. Why would people choose such precarious ground? The answer is rarely ignorance. More often it is a calculation that the advantages of location outweigh the dangers, at least most of the time. Cities are not simply practical. They are acts of optimism, and sometimes the optimism comes with risk built into the foundations. Floodplains offer the most obvious paradox. Rivers flood because they spill over fertile soil, rich with silt, and that same fertility has drawn farmers and settlers for millennia. Cairo is the clearest example. The Nile's annual floods were both destructive and life-giving, replenishing the land and ensuring bountiful harvests. The city thrived because of this rhythm, even though the waters sometimes swept away homes. Today, vast metropolises like Dhaka or Bangkok face the same challenge. Their low-lying positions guarantee access to water and trade, but also expose them to devastating inundations. Engineers build levees, embankments and pumps, but the risk never vanishes. Instead, it becomes part of the city's identity, a reminder that life and danger flow from the same source. Earthquakes pose a different menace, sudden and violent. Tokyo, San Francisco and Mexico City all sit on unstable ground, yet they have flourished despite repeated catastrophes. In each case, geography provides advantages too significant to abandon. Tokyo is the heart of Japan, close to fertile plains and harbours. San Francisco commands a magnificent bay that made it a hub of trade and technology. Mexico City occupies a valley whose soils, though treacherous, once sustained ancient civilizations. People stayed not because they forgot the earthquakes, but because the benefits were irresistible. Over time, architecture adapted. Flexible materials, deep foundations, seismic codes. Yet no engineering can erase the tremor entirely. Living in such cities is a tacit bargain. Prosperity most days, peril on a few. Volcanoes add another layer of fascination. Naples sits beside Vesuvius, the same volcano that buried Pompeii. The risk is obvious, yet the location is too rich to abandon. Fertile volcanic soils support vineyards and farms, The bay offers safe anchorage and the climate is appealing. Millions live in its shadow, accepting the gamble that eruptions come rarely enough to be survivable. In Quito, houses climb up volcanic slopes, their red roofs spread beneath peaks that occasionally smoke. In Catania, life continues within sight of Mount Etna's fiery glow. The danger is ever present, yet the allure of the land, fertile, defensible, beautiful, outweighs fear. Some cities are not only near hazards but almost defined by them. Jakarta is both nourished and threatened by the very rivers and deltas that made it possible. It is sinking under its own weight, its groundwater drained while seas rise at its doorstep. Manila too lies in the path of typhoons and sits near volcanic and seismic zones, yet it thrives as a centre of commerce and culture. These cities embody resilience, living proof that people will adapt again and again rather than abandon places that matter. Why take such risks at all? Part of the explanation lies in immediacy. Fertile plains feed people now, harbours provide trade now, volcanic soils yield crops now. The disasters may come, but not every year. Humans tend to prioritise the advantages they can see over the dangers that seem distant. Risk is tolerated, even normalised, when daily life requires it. Generations may live safely between catastrophes, creating the illusion of permanence. When the earth shakes or the waters rise, the suffering is immense. But once recovery begins, the lure of the same location reasserts itself. Another reason is cultural. Cities that endure disasters often weave them into their identity. Tokyo has rebuilt countless times, and its culture embraces resilience as a kind of civic virtue. Naples turns Vesuvius into part of its mythology, both menace and emblem. Mexico City acknowledges its tremors with architecture that sways gracefully, turning danger into design. These cities are not simply victims of geography. They're shaped by it, their character defined as much by survival as by splendour. History also shows how disasters can be engines of change. After London's Great Fire in the 17th century, new building codes reshaped the city's architecture. After Lisbon's devastating earthquake in 1755, Enlightenment thinkers pioneered new ideas of urban planning and disaster management. Catastrophe forced innovation, and the rebuilt cities were in some ways stronger. Fragile foundations do not always mean fragility of spirit. It is also worth remembering that not all danger is equally constant. Floods may come once a decade, eruptions once a century, major earthquakes once in several lifetimes. To abandon a rich location entirely would mean forfeiting centuries of prosperity for the possibility of rare catastrophe. Most societies make the opposite choice. Take the wealth now, prepare as best they can, and rebuild when disaster strikes. It may not be cautious, but it has proved enduring. Modern technology adds to this confidence. Dams tame floods, seismic engineering softens tremors, and monitoring systems give warning of volcanic unrest. While none of these tools provide absolute safety, they reduce the fear enough that cities can continue to grow. Without them, perhaps Naples would have emptied, or Tokyo would have shrunk. Instead, they remain vibrant, proof that humans will always try to outwit nature. There is, however, a deeper truth in the persistence of fragile cities. Humans are not only practical creatures, they're also attached to place. Once a city becomes a home, with memories, monuments, and meaning, it is hard to abandon. Venice floods with increasing frequency, yet few imagine its people simply leaving. New Orleans faces hurricanes and subsidence, yet its music, food, and culture make it irreplaceable. The emotional geography of cities can outweigh the rational calculation of safety. People will endure risk to keep identity, belonging, and continuity alive. Looking at the map of the world, it is striking how many of its great cities stand on fragile ground. It is not carelessness, but compromise, an acknowledgement that the benefits of rivers, coasts, and fertile soils often come tied to hazards. Civilization has always balanced on this edge, thriving in places where nature both provides and threatens. The ruins of Pompeii, the floods of Dhaka, the tremors of Tokyo, the eruptions of Quito, all remind us that fragility is not the opposite of strength. In the end, fragile foundations tell us something profound about cities. They are not fortresses against nature, but negotiations with it. People weigh danger against opportunity, often choosing to stay where the rewards are richest, even if the risks are greatest. The story of these cities is one of resilience, optimism, and sometimes tragedy, but always of the human determination to live where life feels most possible, even if the earth beneath their feet occasionally shakes or burns. The map of cities has never been fixed, and it will not remain fixed in the centuries to come. Just as rivers once drew farmers, harbours drew merchants, and railways drew workers, the forces of tomorrow will redraw the urban world. Rising seas, shifting climates, new technologies and growing populations will decide which cities flourish, which falter, and which may vanish altogether. To imagine the cities of the future is to ask how humanity will balance opportunity with survival in a world of profound change. One of the most urgent pressures is the sea itself. Many of the world's largest cities, New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, Jakarta, are coastal, thriving because of ports, harbours, and global trade. Yet their very location places them in peril as ice sheets melt and oceans rise. Even modest increases in sea level will worsen flooding, salinize groundwater, and strain infrastructure. Jakarta is already sinking, prompting Indonesia to plan a new capital, Nusantara, inland on Borneo. Other cities may follow, forced either to defend themselves with barriers and pumps, or to retreat step by step as water advances. Future maps may mark not only the growth of new cities but the slow retreat of old ones. Climate change will also redraw the zones of habitability. Regions that are already hot may become too harsh for dense urban life. Parts of the Middle East, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa may face heatwaves so severe that outdoor labour becomes dangerous for much of the year. At the same time, areas once considered too cold could become more inviting. The vast stretches of Canada, Siberia, and Scandinavia may see new or expanded cities as warming makes agriculture and transport more viable. The Arctic coastlines, ice-free for longer periods, could emerge as new trade corridors, bringing investment to previously remote towns. In this way, the planet's temperature map doubles as a future urban map. Fresh water will be as decisive as ever. Cities without secure water supplies will struggle regardless of technology. Already, Cape Town has come close to running dry, and other cities in arid zones face similar risks. Desalination, recycling, and long-distance pipelines will buy time but not without cost. Conversely, regions with abundant rivers, lakes, or reliable rainfall will remain attractive, provided floods can be managed. The geography of water, always central to human settlement, will only become more important as populations swell. Technology will create its own centres of gravity. Cities linked to digital networks, research hubs, and innovation clusters will dominate the economic landscape. Silicon Valley may be joined by new nodes in Africa, South Asia, or Latin America, where young populations and expanding education systems provide fertile ground for technological revolutions. Already, Nairobi is called Silicon Savannah, while Bengaluru thrives as India's tech capital. Future maps may show rising stars in places often overlooked today, as connectivity levels the playing field and talent finds its voice. Transport will also shape the next great centres. High-speed rail is knitting together regions of China and Europe, creating vast urban corridors that function almost as single megacities. Imagine a day when travel between Lagos and Accra, or São Paulo and Buenos Aires, is as fast and seamless as commuting across Tokyo. These corridors could give rise to megalopolises, stretches of continuous urban development hosting tens of millions. The Pearl River Delta in China is already an example. Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, and others merging into one immense urban organism. The future may hold more of these sprawling networks, bound less by city walls than by shared infrastructure. Energy will guide settlement as well. Cities that master renewable power may outpace those reliant on dwindling fossil fuels. Solar-rich deserts could host new centres where energy is abundant and cheap, while windy coasts may anchor clusters of industry tied to offshore turbines. If nuclear fusion ever becomes practical, entirely new geographies may emerge, as energy abundance loosens the grip of fossil fuel corridors. Future cities may cluster not around rivers or coalfields, but around grids of clean power. Some new cities will be born deliberately, planned from scratch to manage population pressure or to symbolize new beginnings. Nusantara is one such project. Egypt is building a new administrative capital east of Cairo. And Kazakhstan raised Astana, now called Astana again after brief renaming on the windswept steppe. These projects show that governments still see relocation and reinvention as viable tools. Whether such planned cities thrive depends on more than design. They must attract people with jobs, culture, and opportunity. Without that, they risk becoming empty monuments, impressive on paper, but lifeless in reality. Migration will continue to swell the larger cities. Rural populations are still moving toward urban centres, especially in Asia and Africa. By mid-century, Lagos may rival or surpass many established giants, while Kinshasa, Dhaka, and Karachi will each hold tens of millions. The scale will be staggering, with entire nations' worth of people living within single metropolitan areas. These megacities will dominate regional economies and politics, shaping culture far beyond their borders. Their challenges, congestion, inequality, pollution, will be immense, but so will their dynamism. Not all the future lies on land. Floating infrastructure, once a fantasy, is beginning to take shape. From floating neighbourhoods in the Netherlands to experimental projects in Asia, people are exploring how to adapt cities to rising seas rather than retreat from them. In the distant future, artificial islands, offshore platforms, or even ocean-based settlements could play a role. The same spirit that once carved Venice from lagoons may inspire new generations to build directly on the water. We should also consider resilience as a factor in the cities of tomorrow. Some places may thrive not because of perfect location, but because they manage hazards better. Tokyo's preparedness for earthquakes, Singapore's careful water management, and Rotterdam's mastery of flood control show how innovation can overcome geography. Future cities may be judged not only by where they stand, but by how well they adapt to what the planet throws at them. The map of tomorrow will not erase the past. Old centres like London, Paris, and Beijing will remain important. Their centuries of infrastructure and cultural weight too entrenched to vanish easily. But the balance of power may tilt toward newer giants, especially in Africa and Asia, where demographic momentum is strongest. Kinshasa, Lagos, Dhaka, and Jakarta could be as influential in the 21st century as Rome, Baghdad, or Constantinople once were in their eras. If there is a lesson to draw, it is that cities are living organisms shaped by both opportunity and constraint. They rise where people see a chance to gather, and they endure as long as they can solve the problems of survival. The next great centres will form where climate, water, energy, and networks align, and where human imagination decides to build. Rising seas may swallow coastlines, droughts may wither plains, but new hubs will spring up, sustained by the same optimism that once carved Petra, raised Angkor, and founded Brasilia. The future map is not a fixed chart waiting to be unveiled. It is a work in progress, drawn daily by choices about where to live, what to build, and how to adapt. Cities may shift inland, northward, or upward. They may sprawl into corridors or condense into compact high-rises. Some will fade, others will be born, but the rhythm will continue. As long as humanity dreams of better lives, there will always be new places marked on the map, new lights glowing in the night, and new centres where the gravity of opportunity and survival come together to make a city. Cities are often seen as monuments to human ambition, places where steel, stone and glass announce our presence on the landscape. Yet beneath every skyline, every winding street and bustling marketplace lies a quieter story, one shaped as much by geography as by human will. To ask why a city stands where it does is to ask about the marriage between people and place, about rivers and ridges, soils and seas, trade winds and frontiers, faith and fear, hope and necessity. The question that has guided our journey, why here, is answered differently in every settlement, yet always with the same blend of chance, constraint, and choice. From the first fires kindled by hunter-gatherers at a river crossing to the megacities of today, the story of urban life has been written on the canvas of the earth. Water, above all, has guided us. Rivers offered sustenance, coasts open to trade, and wells kept villages alive. Without water, cities wither, and with it they flourish, no matter how challenging the surroundings. The Nile, the Tigris, the Thames, the Yangtze, each one has anchored communities for thousands of years, weaving natural flows into human rhythms. Even now, in the age of digital networks and air travel, the story begins with the same essential ingredient, the flow of water through the land. Yet rivers alone do not explain everything. The shape of the land matters just as much. Hills and ridges offered protection, valleys funneled trade, and fertile plains sustained crops. Volcanoes, both menacing and generous, gave soil that was rich enough to justify the risk of eruptions. Mountains hemmed in some cities and defined their skylines, while others sprawled outward endlessly on open plains. Each topography left its imprint, forcing cities into shapes that reflected the terrain beneath them. A map of urban forms is in many ways a shadow map of geology. Beyond the natural lay the cultural and political. Sacred landscapes drew pilgrims who built temples, shrines and marketplaces, turning holy ground into thriving towns. Capitals rose where rulers decreed, bending geography to the weight of power. Empires carved their marks onto the land, founding ports and planned cities that projected authority across oceans. In colonial times, grids and plazas spread like signatures of empire, leaving behind a pattern that can still be traced in cities from the Americas to Asia. The location of a capital or the design of a plaza was not dictated by rivers or soils alone, but by politics, ideology, and the desire to control. Resources added another layer of magnetism. Gold drew rushes of prospectors, coal summoned entire populations into valleys of smoke and steel, and salt carved out trade routes that spanned continents. These were the fragile blooms of urban growth, sudden, intense, and sometimes short-lived. Some resource towns faded into silence when the mines closed, or the wells dried, while others reinvented themselves into permanent cities, their origins hidden beneath a later prosperity. Opportunity has always lured people into uncertain places, and resources have often been the bait. Over time, the gravity of opportunity has shifted. The Industrial Revolution pulled people into smoky metropolises bound to coal and iron, while the modern era pulls people into cities connected by ports, airports, and fibre-optic cables. The meaning of where has changed, but the logic remains the same. Cities grow where connections converge. Once it was the confluence of rivers, now it may be the intersection of air routes or digital networks. The places that thrive are those that sit at the crossroads of movement, whether of goods, people, or ideas. And yet so many of our greatest cities are built on fragile foundations, floodplains, seismic zones, volcanic slopes, places that logic alone might discourage. Here, geography offers both bounty and threat, and people accept the gamble because the rewards are too great to ignore. Naples prospers in the shadow of Vesuvius, Tokyo lives with tremors, and New Orleans stands against the waters of the Mississippi. These choices reveal something deeply human, a willingness to embrace risk for the promise of abundance, beauty, or belonging. Cities are not purely rational constructs, they are expressions of resilience and hope. Looking ahead, the map of the future will not be the same as the map of the present. Rising seas may redraw coastlines, shifting climates may push populations northward or inland, and technology may give rise to new hubs in unexpected places. Some great cities may fade, while others, scarcely imagined today, will rise into prominence. The same forces, water, land, climate, power, and aspiration, will continue to shape them, but in patterns unique to a warming, connected world. The question of why here will echo with new answers, just as it always has. Cities, then, are mirrors, reflecting both the landscapes that sustain them and the ambitions of the people who build them. They are part natural, part cultural, never wholly one or the other. Each one holds its own story. A bend in a river, a sacred spring, a coal seam, a royal decree, a trade wind, a modern highway. Together they form a patchwork of human geography across the planet, a living atlas of the choices and chances that have guided us. And so, as we close this journey, consider the city around you. Its streets, no matter how ordinary, are shaped by forces far older and wider than they appear. The local park may trace the path of an ancient river. The grid of avenues may echo colonial design. The skyline may rise where geology allowed, and the markets may hum because of connections spun across continents. Every city, whether vast metropolis or modest town, carries the weight of geography and the imprint of human aspiration. The question of why here is not just historical, it is personal. It asks why your city stands where it does, why you live where you do, and how your surroundings shape the life you lead. Perhaps it is water, perhaps trade, perhaps culture, perhaps chance. Whatever the answer, your city is part of the same deep story that links Cairo to Mexico City, Rome to Shanghai, Lagos to Los Angeles. The details differ, but the pattern is shared. So let this be a calm farewell. Cities are not random accidents scattered on the land. They are chapters in the long dialogue between people and the earth. They rise, they adapt, they sometimes fall, but always they reflect the forces that brought them into being. The city you inhabit is part of this great pattern, another expression of the timeless question, why here? And in that question lies both the humility of geography and the endless creativity of humanity. As you drift into rest, imagine the lights of cities scattered across the globe, some ancient, some new, some still to be born, each one a spark of life upon the land, a testament to our need to gather, to build, to endure. And remember, wherever you are, your city too is a piece of this deeper design, a quiet answer to a question as old as settlement itself.